There are places in America that once thrived with people, businesses, and dreams, now they're silent, buried in time. Centralia, Pennsylvania. In 1962, a coal fire started underground, and it's still burning. The town has been abandoned. Bodie, California. Once home to thousands during the gold rush, now it's just for tourists. Cairo, Illinois. Once an important city, now it's empty. These towns stand as witnesses to how time erases places. Please press the subscribe button in our channel. So let's start. The forgotten towns of America that disappeared without a trace. Hey guys, tonight we're not dealing with kings, queens, or overly inbred aristocrats. Don't worry, there will still be plenty of questionable life choices and bad planning. Instead, we're going to wander through the American landscape, but not the one you can actually visit. We're going to sink into the dusty records and fading maps of towns that were born with big promises, lived fast, and then, just as quickly, disappeared. So if you're here in bed, maybe wrapped up in a blanket burrito, tonight's journey is going to feel like taking a midnight road trip through places that technically no longer exist. No traffic, no gas stations, just a quiet meander past vanished main streets, rotted out general stores, and a few cemeteries that no one mows anymore. Because yes, every forgotten American town seems to leave behind at least one lonely graveyard. It's basically the check engine light of American history. Now, we're not talking about the glamorous ghost towns out west with saloons and tumbleweeds. Those get the spotlight. Everyone loves a good Wild West aesthetic. Instead, we're exploring the quieter ones, the mining hamlets, railroad experiments, utopian colonies, and company towns that once thought they'd become the next Chicago but ended up becoming a fun fact for some local librarian 120 years later. So dim your lights. Put the phone on Do Not Disturb. And let's float across America's graveyard of forgotten towns. Let's start with a little town in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania always seems to have something cursed going on underground. If you're thinking of Centralia, the coal town that's been on fire since the early 1960s, you're not wrong. But that one's almost too famous. People actually make day trips there, which is about as close as America gets to having a pilgrimage site for pyromaniacs. But long before Centralia made international headlines for literally being a barbecue pit under a highway, Pennsylvania had dozens of little coal company towns. One of them was called Laurel Run. Now, Laurel Run isn't fully gone, it's technically still on the map, but back in 1915, it joined the club of underground fire disasters when a coal seam lit up. And once a coal seam starts burning, that's basically game over. You can't exactly call the fire department and expect them to dump a few buckets on it. These fires can burn for centuries, moving slowly underground like the world's most boring lava flow. Laurel Run smoldered, smoked, and slowly turned into a place people didn't really want to live in anymore. Imagine sitting on your porch while the ground gently exhales sulfur into your iced tea. Not exactly Zillow material. Families moved out. Houses were condemned. A few stubborn people stayed, because of course they did, but by the mid-20th century, it was basically an accidental ghost town. The fire still burns today, more than 100 years later. Think of it as Pennsylvania's eternal candle, except instead of peace, it gives off carbon monoxide. Floating away from coal country, let's head west, because America's forgotten towns are basically a buffet of bad idea plus overconfidence. Enter the town of Cahaba, Alabama. Now, Cahaba had an impressive start. It was the very first state capital of Alabama. That sounds pretty promising, right? Like, welcome to the capital. We've got politics, society balls, and the governor's mansion. Except Cahaba had one small flaw. It was built right on a floodplain at the confluence of two rivers. And in case you're not familiar with hydrology, that's like putting your state capital on top of a slip-and slide. Every time it rained, Cahaba got swamped. Entire streets turned into Venetian canals, minus the gondolas. The residents were not thrilled, and by 1826, just a few years after the town was founded, the capital was quietly moved to Tuscaloosa. Which, to be honest, is a downgrade in name but a big upgrade in not drowning. Cahaba limped along for a few decades. People tried to make it work. Cotton planters settled there, and during the Civil War, the Confederacy even set up a prison camp in town. That's always a bad sign, when your local economy has to pivot from state capital to POW warehouse. By the late 19th century, floods, mosquitoes, and the general feeling that maybe this town was cursed pushed people out for good. Now all that's left are ruins, brick chimneys, and the occasional ghost tour. Yes, it has the obligatory ghost lore, because apparently any abandoned southern town automatically gets at least 3 Confederate ghosts and a crying woman in white. From Alabama's swampy ambitions, let's meander north to Illinois. Specifically, to a little place called Leffingwell, which I promise you've never heard of. That's the thing about these lost towns, they often don't even make it into local trivia nights. Leffingwell was one of many tiny railroad towns in the Midwest that existed purely because a track was laid nearby. In the 1800s, railroads were like magic. If your town got a stop, you were basically blessed with eternal life. If the tracks bypassed you, it was social death. People packed up and left overnight, like their town was a discontinued product. Leffingwell's problem wasn't dramatic. No fires, no floods, no plagues of locusts. Just irrelevance. The railroad rerouted. The post office closed. And without those 2 arteries pumping life into it, the town dried up like an old corn husk. Today, if you drive through the area, you might find a signpost or maybe a foundation stone buried in weeds. That's it. Leffingwell became a kind of non-place, proof that sometimes the scariest disaster for a town isn't fire or flood, but simply being forgotten. Now, let's float into the territory of utopian experiments gone wrong, because 19th century America was full of those. Everyone and their cousin thought they could create the perfect society. Usually this involved growing a lot of cabbages, banning fun, and writing really long community rules. Enter the town of New Harmony, Indiana. New Harmony was founded in 1814 by a group called the Harmony Society, who were German religious separatists. They believed in celibacy, which, spoiler alert, is not a great long-term growth strategy. They farmed, they sang hymns, they wore plain clothes, and they managed to build a surprisingly prosperous little community. But after a decade, they sold the whole town to Robert Owen, a Welsh industrialist who thought he could turn it into a secular utopia. Owen's version of New Harmony was big on education, science, and social equality. Sounds pretty nice, right? The only problem was, the people he attracted were, well, let's just say not the most practical. You had philosophers, dreamers, amateur scientists, and probably at least one guy who only showed up for free food. No one actually wanted to do the farming or the boring daily labor. Within a couple of years, the town was falling apart, and by the 1820s the utopian dream had pretty much dissolved. Today, New Harmony survives as a kind of historical park. Which is a fancy way of saying, we turned your failed dream into a tourist attraction. Sliding over to the southwest now. Arizona is littered with forgotten towns, thanks to the boom and bust cycle of mining. If you had copper, gold, or silver, you could throw up a town in the desert and watch it grow overnight. But the second the ore ran out, or prices dropped, poof, it was gone. Take the town of Swansea, Arizona. Swansea was founded in the early 1900s as a copper mining town. It had everything, a saloon, a general store, even a moving picture theater. The mining company was so confident they named it after Swansea in Wales, because apparently nothing says, prosperous future, like pretending you're British. But copper prices tanked after World War I, and by the 1930s, the town was abandoned. Today it's just crumbling ruins in the desert, with rusting equipment and the occasional adventurous hiker who wonders why on earth anyone thought Desert Copper Town was a good retirement plan. And speaking of questionable planning, let's take a detour to the Great Plains, where many towns were built on sheer optimism. One of my favorites is Nicodemus, Kansas. Now, Nicodemus is unique. It was founded in 1877 by African-American homesteaders, many of them formerly enslaved, who wanted to create a self-sufficient black community in the West. For a while, it thrived. Families built homes, farms, schools, and churches. It was a symbol of resilience and hope. But the Kansas prairie is not exactly the friendliest place to start from scratch. Droughts, crop failures, and the lack of a reliable railroad connection slowly strangled the town's growth. By the early 20th century, many residents had left for better opportunities elsewhere. Nicodemus never fully disappeared. Today, it's preserved as a National Historic Site, but the bustling, thriving community it once dreamed of becoming never really materialized. It became another casualty of geography, economics, and the endless grind of farming against the odds. We've only just started this drift through America's forgotten towns, and already we've seen coal fires, floods, utopias, mining busts, and prairie struggles. Each of these places thought they were on the map forever. But towns are fragile things. They depend on rivers that don't flood, mines that don't run out, railroads that don't reroute, and communities that actually want to stay. And spoiler alert, most of them don't last. So let's keep floating, deeper into the map, where more towns have faded into weeds, legends, or just empty names on a crumbling gravestone. Oil booms, drowned towns, and other American vanishings. Alright, let's tuck ourselves back in. We're still wandering the ghostly map of America, where towns bloomed, bragged, and then disappeared like they were never there. Last time, we floated through coal fires, utopian disasters, and floodplain capital cities. Tonight, we're sinking into another set of forgotten stories. This time, oil booms that fizzled, towns drowned under man-made lakes, and a few unfortunate communities that trusted the government way too much. Spoiler, don't do that. So, let's pick up our lantern and shuffle down the road to Texas. Texas has always had a habit of sprouting towns overnight whenever someone thought they struck oil. And to be fair, sometimes that gamble worked. Places like Houston and Dallas didn't exactly stay quiet prairie crossroads. But for every success story, there were dozens of little oil boom towns that went from tent camps to full cities to abandoned wastelands in the time it takes most people to finish building a porch swing. Take the town of Thurber, Texas. If you've never heard of Thurber, that's kind of the point. Back in the 1880s, Thurber was founded as a coal mining company town. It wasn't just a little operation either. At its peak, Thurber had thousands of residents. Italians, Poles, and Mexicans came to work the mines, and the company, like many benevolent employers, decided it would control pretty much every aspect of their lives. The workers were paid in company scrip, which could only be spent at company stores. The houses were owned by the company. The church was sponsored by the company. And if you're noticing a theme here, yes, it was basically feudalism with cowboy hats. But coal wasn't the eternal resource they hoped it would be. By the 1920s, oil had overtaken coal in Texas, and Thurber's mines were shut down. Without the mines, there was no town. By 1935, Thurber was a ghost town. All that remains now is a few brick buildings, some ruins, and a smokestack that looks like a giant tombstone. Which, honestly, is what it is, a monument to an entire community that existed only because someone needed cheap coal. From coal in Texas, let's slide north to Oklahoma. If you think Texas had oil fever, Oklahoma was right there competing. During the early 1900s, Oklahoma had dozens of boomtowns, places that mushroomed almost overnight with wells, derricks, and hastily thrown together saloons. One of these was a town called Pitcher. Now, Pitcher wasn't just an oil town, it was a lead and zinc mining hub. By World War I, it was producing most of the lead for American bullets. So if you've ever wondered where the metal for trench warfare came from, congratulations, it probably passed through Pitcher. At its peak, the town had about 14,000 people, schools, theaters, the works. And then, as always, the mines closed. By the 1960s, the industry was gone. But Pitcher's problem was worse than just unemployment. Decades of careless mining had left giant piles of toxic waste everywhere, chat piles, they're called, that leached lead into the soil and water. Kids growing up in Pitcher in the late 20th century had staggering rates of lead poisoning. To add insult to injury, in 2008 a tornado tore through the town, flattening much of what was left. The federal government basically shrugged and said, "Okay, you should all leave now." And they did. Today Pitcher is fenced off, declared unsafe, and officially one of the largest Superfund sites in America. Basically, it was erased twice, once by industry, and once by its own poisonous leftovers. Let's drift away from toxic piles and move to something a little more scenic, drowned towns. Yes, America has a surprisingly long list of communities that were deliberately flooded to make way for reservoirs. Picture this. Your grandparents build a house, you grow up there, and then one day the Army Corps of Engineers knocks and says, "Good news, we're turning your whole valley into a lake. Pack up." One of the most famous cases is Kennett, California. Kennett was a lively little town in the early 20th century. It had saloons, a railroad, hotels, and even an opera house, because apparently every dusty mining town needed at least one place for slightly off-key arias. But Kennett was in the wrong spot, smack in the middle of where the government decided to build Shasta Dam. When the dam was completed in the 1940s, the entire town was submerged under what is now Shasta Lake. Every once in a while, during severe droughts, the lake level drops enough that parts of Kennett reappear. Foundations, bricks, little fragments of streets poke through the mud like ghosts coming up for air. Locals sometimes boat out and take pictures, as if to say, "Yep, it was real. People lived here. Now it's fish habitat." And Kennett wasn't alone. Town drowning became a bit of a mid-century trend. For example, the state of Georgia had an entire town called Oscarville that was swallowed up by the creation of Lake Lanier in the 1950s. Now, Lake Lanier has its own modern reputation for being haunted, which is probably just a mix of urban legend and too many jet skis. But the bones of Oscarville are still down there, preserved underwater. Streets, cemeteries, and church ruins lie below what is now a recreational lake. It's hard not to think about how surreal it must have been. Imagine being told your town was about to be erased, and the best you could do was move the headstones and watch bulldozers knock down your schoolhouse. Then, a few years later, people are water skiing over where you used to buy groceries. That's a level of existential irony even the 19th century utopians would have admired. Now let's amble east for a while, to a little town called Dana, Massachusetts. Dana was one of 4 towns wiped off the map to make way for the Quabbin Reservoir in the 1930s. The state decided Boston needed drinking water more than Western Massachusetts needed communities, which is the kind of math city governments are really good at. Dana and its neighbors, Greenwich, Prescott, and Enfield, were all evacuated, bulldozed, and drowned. Families had to move, schools were torn down, even cemeteries were relocated. Today, you can hike around the edges of the reservoir and still find stone walls, cellar holes, and foundations from the old towns. It's eerily quiet, like the land is remembering people who were forcibly forgotten. And just to add insult, the reservoir is stunningly beautiful. Perfect blue water, forested shores, and the occasional bald eagle soaring overhead. It's like the state was saying, yes, we destroyed your home, but look at the nice lake we gave Boston. Of course, not all forgotten towns were drowned by design. Some just sort of collapsed under their own absurd ambitions. Let's take a little detour to California for one of the stranger ones, Llano del Rio. Founded in 1914 by socialist Job Harriman, Llano del Rio was supposed to be the largest utopian community in the American West. Harriman had run for mayor of Los Angeles and lost, so naturally, his backup plan was, I'll start a desert commune. Over 1,000 people joined him in the Mojave Desert, where they tried to build a self-sufficient socialist paradise. The only problem was, it was the Mojave Desert. You can imagine how well farming went. The community struggled with water shortages, internal disputes, and the general problem that utopias always attract equal parts idealists and freeloaders. By 1918, the whole thing collapsed, and most of the residents moved on. What's left today are crumbling concrete ruins, walls, archways, and scattered foundations baking in the desert sun. If you drive by, it looks less like a failed commune and more like the set of a post-apocalyptic movie. Which, honestly, is kind of fitting. Now, since we're in California already, let's float north to Bodie. And yes, I know, Bodie is technically famous, not forgotten. It's one of the most well-preserved ghost towns in the US. But what's funny is that Bodie, in its heyday, was not exactly anyone's idea of paradise. Bodie was a gold mining town that exploded in population during the 1870s. At its peak, it had around 10,000 people and more than 60 saloons. That's 6 saloons per 1,000 residents, which tells you everything you need to know about daily life there. Violence, gambling, fires, and general debauchery were so common that people used to joke about the bad man from Bodie. One little girl, upon learning her family was moving there, supposedly prayed, "Goodbye, God, we're going to Bodie." By the early 20th century, the gold ran out, and Bodie emptied almost as fast as it filled. Today it's a state historic park, kept in what they call arrested decay, which basically means it's allowed to slowly rot in an aesthetically pleasing way. Windows still have curtains, shelves still have dishes, and it all looks like the people just walked out one day and never came back. Which is exactly what happened. Let's meander back toward the Midwest, because I promised you more towns nobody remembers. Enter Elkhorn, Missouri. Elkhorn was founded in the early 1800s, a little rural hamlet with a blacksmith, a few stores, and the usual small-town charm. The railroad skipped it, and by the late 19th century, people just stopped living there. Nothing dramatic. No disaster. No corporate conspiracy. Just slow, gentle abandonment. Today, all that's left of Elkhorn is a cemetery. That's it. Rows of old tombstones surrounded by farmland, marking the last traces of a community that once had ambitions, gossip, and probably at least one guy everyone avoided at church picnics. That's the thing about forgotten towns, they're not always dramatic. Sometimes, they just exhale and fade away, leaving only stone markers and weeds. So far we've had drowned towns, poisoned towns, towns built on bad ideas, and towns erased by railroad maps. And the deeper we wander into this landscape, the clearer it gets, permanence is an illusion. Even in a country that loves to brag about its wide-open frontiers and endless opportunity, communities can vanish in the blink of an eye, or the slow sigh of a century. But we're not done yet. The road keeps winding. And there are still plenty more forgotten places to drift through. Planned communities, vanished south, and company town oddities. So, you're still here. Good. That means you're either already asleep with the video running in the background, or you've decided that a few more vanished towns are exactly the bedtime snack your brain needed. Either way, let's keep walking down this dusty road of forgotten America. Last time, we left off with drowned towns in Massachusetts and abandoned mining hubs out west. This time, we're heading south for some watery erasures, then sideways into the corporate experiments that people optimistically called model communities. Spoiler, they were not models of anything except how to accidentally create feudal villages with better branding. So let's start by pulling up our imaginary map and pointing toward Tennessee. One of the more famous drowned towns of the South was Butler, Tennessee. Butler was a cozy little Appalachian town sitting along the Watauga River. People lived there for generations. Churches, farms, general stores, the whole Norman Rockwell package. Then came the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1930s, with its shiny New Deal dam projects. The TVA wanted to build the Watauga Dam, which was great news for electricity and flood control, but catastrophic news for Butler. The valley where the town sat was destined to become a lake bed. In 1948, the government finally told the people of Butler to pack up and move. Buildings were torn down, families scattered, and the old town disappeared under what is now Watauga Lake. A new Butler was built a few miles away, which sounds like a consolation prize. Imagine losing your home and being told, "Don't worry, we'll give you a new one, but it'll be slightly worse." Today, scuba divers sometimes explore the remnants of old Butler when the water level drops low enough. Streets, sidewalks, and stone foundations are still down there, just sitting in silence. And Butler wasn't alone. North Carolina has its own drowned community story, Judson. Judson sat along the Little Tennessee River, a small mountain town founded in the 19th century. For decades, it thrived quietly, just a dot on the map where farmers and shopkeepers did their thing. Then came the Fontana Dam, also a TVA project during World War II. The government needed hydroelectric power to fuel aluminum plants for the war effort. So, goodbye Judson. By 1944, the whole valley was flooded. The town's cemetery was relocated, but many of the buildings were just left to drown. What makes Judson stand out is the way its memory haunts the landscape. The modern Fontana Lake is a popular boating spot, and on very dry years, bits of the old town re-emerge. Chimneys, stone walls, and the ghostly outlines of buildings peek above the water. Imagine speeding along in your base boat and suddenly realizing you're gliding over someone's old backyard. Sleep well with that image. Let's shuffle a little deeper south, to Alabama, for a case that was less drowned by government and more abandoned by economics. Say hello to the town of Langdale. Langdale was one of several cotton mill villages built along the Chattahoochee River in the 19th century. These towns were classic, company towns, built and owned by the textile corporations that wanted a captive workforce. And, as always, the setup was suspiciously convenient for the company. Workers lived in company housing, bought from company stores, and worshipped in company-built churches. There was no escaping the corporate grip. At its peak, Langdale and its sister towns were bustling little communities, humming with the noise of looms and spinning machines. But the American textile industry didn't exactly stay strong. By the late 20th century, factories shut down or moved overseas. Langdale's mill closed in 2006, and the town quickly withered. Today, it's part of a larger municipality called Valley, Alabama, but the original Langdale mill buildings stand abandoned, hulking brick shells by the river, slowly crumbling. What was once a community is now just a historical marker and a cautionary tale about depending on a single industry. Now, since we're on the topic of company towns, let's wander into the stranger ones. Enter Pullman, Illinois. Yes, that Pullman, the one associated with the famous sleeping cars on trains. In the 1880s, George Pullman decided to build a model town for his factory workers on the south side of Chicago. On paper, it sounded nice: neat brick row houses, schools, libraries, and manicured lawns. Pullman wanted his workers to live in comfort, because a happy workforce is a productive workforce, right? Except, of course, there was a catch. Pullman controlled everything: rents, utilities, even which flowers could be planted in your yard. Workers had no say in governance. And when the economy dipped in 1893, Pullman cut wages but refused to lower rents. You can probably see where this is going. In 1894, the workers went on strike, and the Pullman strike quickly snowballed into a nationwide railroad strike. The U.S. Army was called in, and violence broke out. The model town ended up being Exhibit A in why paternalistic capitalism doesn't work. Pullman himself died in 1897, buried under a layer of concrete to protect his grave from angry workers. Subtle. Today, the old Pullman district is a national monument, preserved as an architectural curiosity, but also a reminder of how quickly utopia turns into dystopia when you hand the boss the keys to your life. From Chicago, let's float back down to Florida, where forgotten towns tend to vanish under swamps rather than bad bosses. One particularly curious example is the town of Ellaville. Ellaville was founded in the 1860s by a businessman named George Drew, who built a sawmill on the Suwannee River. The mill was one of the largest in Florida, and the town grew up around it: workers, stores, even a steamboat dock. Ellaville peaked in the 1870s, when Drew himself became governor of Florida. But the good times didn't last. The forests were over-harvested, the mill closed, and by the early 20th century, Ellaville was in steep decline. Floods and the Great Depression delivered the final blow. Today, Ellaville is nothing more than ruins hidden in the woods, a collapsing bridge, some scattered bricks, and the vague sense that mosquitoes now own the place. And since we're in Florida, let's not skip Rosewood. Rosewood was a small, predominantly black town in Levy County, founded in the late 19th century. For a while, it thrived quietly: families farming, kids attending the local school, people going about their business. But in 1923, Rosewood was destroyed in one of the most violent racial massacres in American history. White mobs burned the town to the ground after false rumors spread about a crime. Survivors fled and never returned. Rosewood was literally wiped off the map. For decades, the story was buried, locals didn't talk about it, history books ignored it, and the land was left empty. Only in the 1990s did the state of Florida acknowledge what happened and compensate survivors' families. Today, Rosewood is remembered through a memorial marker, but the town itself is gone. Unlike the drowned towns, nothing physical remains, just the heavy absence of what was erased. From Florida's tragedies, let's meander back to the Midwest for a palate cleanser, a town that disappeared mostly because of sheer bad luck. Say hello to Dorena, Missouri. Dorena was a small farming town along the Mississippi River, founded in the 19th century. It wasn't flashy, but it was steady. The problem was geography. The Mississippi is not exactly a gentle neighbor, and Dorena sat on land that loved to flood. By the mid-20th century, repeated floods and the decline of river traffic had hollowed out the town. Then, in the 1990s, the government built the Dorena-Hickman ferry landing nearby, which kind of overshadowed the original community. Today, Dorena is barely a blip: some houses, a few ruins, and a cemetery. It's not gone, but it's faded so far that you can stand there and not realize a whole town once existed. Now, we can't do a tour of vanished towns without taking a quick jog to New Jersey. Yes, New Jersey, land of diners, highways, and, surprisingly, ghost towns. The Pine Barrens region is full of them, thanks to abandoned ironworks, glass factories, and small settlements that peaked in the 18th and 19th centuries. One of the best known is Batstow. Batstow Village started in the 1760s as an iron-making community, producing supplies for the Continental Army during the Revolution. Later, it pivoted to glassmaking. For a while, it was a busy little industrial hub in the middle of the pines. But industries shifted, and Batstow declined through the 19th century. By the 20th century, it was mostly deserted. Today, Batstow is preserved as a historic site, with its old mansion, barns, and workers' houses restored for visitors. It's one of the rare ghost towns that's been carefully curated instead of left to rot. Which, honestly, makes it feel less like a ghost town and more like a museum exhibit where ghosts happen to pay rent. So where are we now? We've walked through drowned valleys, feudal mill towns, Florida swamps, and piney ruins. And what ties them together is this: towns vanish for all kinds of reasons. Some drown under reservoirs. Some collapse when industries dry up. Some are destroyed violently, while others just fade away like old ink on a map. Each one leaves traces, sometimes underwater, sometimes in weeds, sometimes only in memory. But the stories linger. And the more you look for them, the more you realize America is littered with these vanished places. It's like a second, invisible country underneath the one we live in. And, of course, we're not done yet. The road keeps going. More towns are waiting around the bend, half erased, still whispering through the cracks. Paper towns, planned cities, and desert dreams. Welcome back, night travelers. You're still here, which means either you've decided ghostly American geography is your new bedtime hobby, or you've fallen asleep and left the autoplay running. Either way, I'll take it. So far we've drifted through drowned valleys, coal towns that turned into fire pits, utopian flops, and company villages that felt like capitalism with a landlord problem. Tonight, we're getting even stranger. We're heading into the world of planned cities, towns designed from the ground up to be perfect. Which, spoiler, never works. Then we'll visit a few phantom towns that only existed on maps, paper towns, meant to trick copyright thieves. And we'll finish off in the deserts, where optimism went to die under the hot sun. So let's wander first into the land of the planners. One of the more infamous, planned, communities in American history is Fordlandia. Yes, that's a real name. And yes, it was exactly what you think, a town created by Henry Ford. Because why stop at building cars when you can also try to build an entire society? In the 1920s, Ford realized he needed a steady supply of rubber for his tires. Rather than buy it from established plantations in Southeast Asia, he decided he'd just build his own rubber empire in Brazil. Logical. So he bought a giant tract of land along the Tapajos River in the Amazon rainforest and set about creating a Midwestern-style town in the jungle. Fordlandia had neat little houses, white picket fences, a golf course, even a cafeteria where workers were forced to eat hamburgers and drink coffee, because apparently importing small-town Michigan culture to the Amazon was part of the business plan. It didn't go well. The rubber trees didn't grow properly in plantation rows, they got wiped out by pests and disease. The Brazilian workers didn't care for the hamburgers, preferring their own food, and riots broke out over Ford's obsession with mandatory square dancing nights. Yes, really. Square dancing in the Amazon. By the 1940s, Fordlandia was abandoned. Today it's just decaying ruins, water towers, empty houses, and a ghostly grid of streets slowly being eaten by the rainforest. Henry Ford lost about $20 million on the experiment. Which is a lot to pay for a jungle square dance. Of course, Ford wasn't the only industrialist who thought he could design a utopia. Let's float over to Arizona, where Frank Lloyd Wright, yes, the architect, tried something similar. In the 1930s, Wright proposed a city called Broadacre City. It wasn't a traditional town so much as a blueprint for how America should live. Each family would get an acre of land, cars would dominate everything, and skyscrapers would be scattered like confetti across the horizon. The idea was less about community and more about spreading everyone out so far that you'd never have to talk to your neighbors. Which, admittedly, sounds appealing to some people. But Broadacre City was never actually built, except in models. Turns out no one wanted to fund an experiment that was basically suburbia on steroids. Still, the plan influenced a lot of American development. So in a way, every soulless suburban sprawl with 6 targets and a Chili's is Broadacre City's spiritual descendant. Sleep well knowing that. Now, some planned communities did get built, they just didn't survive. One eerie example is Athelstan, Arkansas. Athelstan was originally laid out as a bustling railroad town. Neat grid of streets, commercial blocks, all the stuff you'd expect. Except the railroad decided to put its lines slightly elsewhere. Which meant Athelstan never got the traffic it needed. By the 1950s, the town was basically gone. Today, it's an official ghost town. Which sounds very ceremonial, like someone cut a ribbon and said, "Congratulations, you're dead." All that remains are overgrown foundations and a scattering of brick piles. Let's wander into a slightly different category now, paper towns. These are my favorite, because they're not ghost towns you can visit, they're ghost towns that never even existed. Back in the 20th century, mapmakers had a problem. Other companies would copy their maps without permission, which was hard to prove in court. So cartographers came up with a trick, they'd add a fake town or street name. If that same fake name appeared on a competitor's map, bingo, plagiarism proven. One of the most famous is Agloe, New York. Agloe appeared on maps in the 1930s as a little dot in the Catskills. It was totally made up, invented by the General Drafting Company. But here's where it gets weird. Eventually, a general store was built at that location, and people started referring to it as Agloe. So the fake town sort of manifested into reality, at least briefly. By the 1970s, the store closed, and Agloe faded back into being fictional. But the name lingered on maps for decades, confusing hikers and delighting nerds. It's basically a town that existed because people believed it existed. Which, if you think about it, is not that different from half the utopias we've covered. Now, while Agloe is funny, most planned towns weren't whimsical, they were corporate. Let's drift over to Hershey, Pennsylvania. You probably know the name. Yes, that Hershey. In the early 1900s, Milton Hershey decided to build a model town for his chocolate factory workers. Unlike Pullman, Hershey actually put some effort into making it pleasant. He built schools, parks, a theater, and even an amusement park. Workers had decent housing, and the company sponsored all sorts of community activities. It wasn't perfect, Hershey still controlled everything, but it was nicer than most company towns. The difference was, Hershey's factory never collapsed. Chocolate demand stayed strong. So unlike Thurber or Pullman, the town of Hershey still exists today. It's basically a living relic of the company town era, only this one smells faintly of cocoa instead of coal dust. Of course, not all company experiments fared so well. Take Scotia, California. Scotia was founded in the 1880s by the Pacific Lumber Company as a mill town. For a century, it thrived, neat houses, schools, a hospital, even its own bank. But by the 2000s, the timber industry collapsed under environmental regulations and overharvesting. Scotia's population plummeted, and the company literally went bankrupt. The town, once privately owned, had to be slowly sold off to residents and developers. Today, it's limping along as a semi-ghost, a reminder that even the mightiest lumber empire eventually runs out of trees. Now let's wander back south again, because no tour of vanished towns is complete without Texas. And Texas has some of the strangest planned community failures you'll ever find. Take Toyah, Texas. Toyah was founded in the late 1800s as a ranching and railroad town. By the early 20th century, it had a school, a bank, several hotels, and about 1,000 residents. People thought it was destined to grow. Instead, Toyah became the poster child for death by neglect. The railroad rerouted. Farming declined. The town was hit by multiple floods, wiping out homes and businesses. By the early 2000s, Toyah was down to a handful of residents. The school collapsed in a storm, the stores boarded up, and today it's a shell. Just empty streets, a few scattered houses, and the ghosts of optimism. But let's save the strangest for last, California City. Yes, that's its actual name. Founded in 1958, California City was planned as a massive desert metropolis. Developers carved out a grid of streets in the Mojave Desert, plotting out a city that would rival Los Angeles. They built a golf course, an artificial lake, and an airport, then sat back to wait for the millions of residents who were definitely going to move in. They didn't. California City flopped almost instantly. It turns out most people weren't eager to live in the middle of a desert with no jobs. Today, California City is technically still a city, with about 15,000 residents, but the vast majority of its planned streets are empty. If you look at it from the air, it's surreal, miles of paved roads leading nowhere, cul-de-sacs surrounded by desert scrub, like a ghost city built for no one. It's often used as an example in urban planning textbooks of how not to design a community. So what do we have tonight? We've wandered through Henry Ford's Amazonian square dance, cartographers' fake towns, chocolate utopias, lumber empires, and empty desert grids. Each one was born from ambition, corporate ambition, personal ambition, or just cartographic pettiness. And each one ended up somewhere between absurd and forgotten. What all these stories tell us is that towns aren't immortal. They depend on resources, railroads, rivers, or just sheer stubbornness. And when those vanish, the towns vanish too. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, sometimes only on paper. And we're still not done. The map has plenty more little dots to explore. Drowned towns, burned-out mill villages, desert oddities, and the ones that slipped so far from memory that even the locals can't find them anymore. But for now, let's close the notebook on this part of the journey. Because the road, and the ruin, always continues. Drowned, buried, and frozen away. Welcome back, night listeners. If you're still with me, you've either developed a soft spot for abandoned sidewalks, or you're trapped under your blankets and too cozy to move. Either way, I'll take it. Tonight, we're leaving the deserts and paper maps behind, and we're heading into the drowned, the buried, and the frozen corners of forgotten America. Some towns were wiped out by water, swallowed by dams and reservoirs in the name of progress. Others got buried alive in sand, literally. And then there are the ones built in places so cold and miserable that people abandoned them the moment the money ran out. So let's step gently into the water first. One of the most famous drowned towns in the United States is right in New York, Neversink. Yes, the irony is almost too much. In the 1950s, New York City needed more drinking water, so the state decided to build the Neversink Reservoir. Entire villages, including Neversink itself, were condemned and flooded. Families were forced to move, houses bulldozed, cemeteries relocated. Well, most cemeteries. Some graves were left behind, so if you scuba dive in the reservoir, which, by the way, is not recommended, you're technically swimming over bits of 19th century history. Comforting thought next time you drink New York tap water. Today, Neversink lives on only in name. A new Neversink was built nearby, but the original lies quietly underwater, preserved in silence. Which is, honestly, one of the coziest ways for a town to end. But Neversink wasn't alone. Across the country, hundreds of small towns were deliberately drowned to make way for dams. It was the mid-20th century obsession with hydroelectric power and giant water projects. Flood control, irrigation, power generation, progress demanded sacrifice, and the sacrifice was usually some tiny town no one in Washington had ever heard of. Let's drift south to Tennessee, where the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, was building dams in the 1930s and 40s. Entire communities vanished beneath the waterline. One example is Butler, Tennessee. Butler was a small but lively town with schools, shops, and churches. But when Watauga Dam was built in 1948, the town was moved. Not metaphorically. Literally moved. Buildings were relocated uphill to form New Butler. The old Butler. It's now at the bottom of Watauga Lake, sometimes nicknamed the town that wouldn't drown. Why? Because in drought years, the old roads and building foundations resurface, like ghosts stubbornly refusing to stay submerged. Now, not every drowned town got the courtesy of being rebuilt. Let's float out to California, again, where the town of Monticello was sacrificed to create Lake Berryessa in the 1950s. Monticello wasn't tiny. It had farms, a school, even a few hundred residents. But the Solano project needed a reservoir, so Monticello had to go. Today, all that remains is the Monticello Dam and its famous Glory Hole spillway, a giant concrete drain that looks like something out of a surreal dream. When the water's high, it swallows whole trees, boats, and whatever else drifts too close. Beneath the waves, Monticello is still there in fragments, foundations, fence posts, bits of orchards that never made it. People water ski above them without giving it much thought. Let's leave the water now and wander into something stranger, towns buried alive in sand. Yes, that happened. Take the story of Dawson, Nebraska. Dawson was founded in the mid-19th century, a typical prairie settlement. But the nearby sand hills didn't stay put. Winds picked up and, slowly but relentlessly, the sand began to overtake the town. By the early 20th century, whole streets were half buried. Residents gave up trying to dig themselves out and just moved away. Today, Dawson is technically still there, but only a fraction of what it once was. Sand won that round. Even more dramatic is the story of the town of Dunwich, sorry, not that Dunwich, the creepy one from Lovecraft. This Dunwich was a Massachusetts coastal settlement, slowly eaten by shifting sands and erosion. Over centuries, whole sections slid into the sea or vanished under dunes. By the 20th century, Dunwich was mostly just memory and shoreline ghosts. But the strangest, buried alive, story might be Texas's own Sanderson. Not quite buried, but close. Sanderson was devastated by floods that dumped tons of silt and mud into the town in the 1960s. Whole blocks were swallowed up. Residents dug, rebuilt, and dug again, but the scars never quite healed. Today, Sanderson limps along as a half-ghost, half-living settlement, never sure whether it wants to stay on the map. Now let's pull on our parkas and wander north, to the frozen outposts. Because if you think it was a good idea to build mining camps in Alaska and the Arctic, you're not alone. A lot of investors thought the same. And almost all of them regretted it. Take the town of Dyea, Alaska. Dyea was once the starting point of the Chilkoot Trail during the Klondike Gold Rush of the 1890s. For a few brief years, it boomed, saloons, shops, tent cities, all crammed with desperate fortune seekers. But Dyea's harbor was shallow, too shallow for big ships. When nearby Skagway proved to be more convenient, everyone abandoned Dyea almost overnight. Today, All that's left are collapsing wooden buildings, mossy grave markers, and the faint grid of streets in the tundra. The silence there is so total it feels staged. Farther north, in the Arctic proper, there were even wilder experiments. Let's talk about Barter Island, Alaska. In the 1950s, the US military decided to build a radar station there for the distant early warning line, basically a string of outposts designed to spot Soviet bombers. Along with the station came a town of sorts, complete with housing, mess halls, and recreation. It was miserable. Freezing winds, months of darkness, supplies flown in by desperate pilots. As the Cold War shifted, most of these outposts were abandoned. The shells of buildings remain, rusting in the permafrost. Not towns in the traditional sense, but close enough to count as communities lost to time. And then there's Kennecott, Alaska. Founded around 1900 as a copper mining town, Kennecott was built with massive processing mills and housing for hundreds of workers. For 3 decades it thrived, shipping copper south. But by 1938, the ore ran out. Practically overnight, the company pulled out and left the town behind. Workers literally walked away, leaving behind equipment, furniture, even dishes on tables. Today, Kennecott is preserved as a historic landmark, one of the best preserved ghost towns in America. Walking through it feels like a freeze frame of 1930s life, except it's in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by glaciers. Back in the lower 48, cold climates had their own failures. Consider Garnett, Montana. Garnett was a gold mining town founded in the 1890s. At its peak, about 1,000 people lived there. But harsh winters and declining gold drove most of them out by 1917. A fire in 1912 didn't help. By the mid-20th century, Garnett was a ghost. Unlike other ghost towns, though, Garnett is unusually intact. Wooden storefronts, hotels, saloons, all still standing in eerie silence. Tourists can wander through and imagine just how badly those winters sucked. So where does this leave us? In this part, we've floated over drowned valleys, wandered through sandy graves, and shivered in Arctic outposts. Each one a reminder that towns are fragile, temporary, and very dependent on nature's mood. Water, sand, cold, all of them have a way of winning in the long run. Human ambition builds towns, but rivers flood, dunes march forward, and glaciers don't care about your copper mill. The result? Silence, emptiness, and ruins that whisper stories no one asked to remember. And yet, they are remembered. Because here we are, telling their stories under a dim light, drifting into sleep while imagining sand dunes swallowing rooftops or a town that only exists underwater. But we're not quite finished. There are still more strange dots on the map, resort towns that died overnight, amusement parks that became creepy husks, and suburban developments that never grew past one cul-de-sac. Those will be for the next part. For now, though, let's set this lantern down. The drowned, the buried, and the frozen can rest. And so can you. Resorts that checked out and never came back. Hey night wanderers. Still with me? Good. Or maybe not, maybe you're already asleep with your phone slipping slowly toward your forehead. Which is fine, that's what this is for. So far, we've covered drowned towns, desert flops, and frozen mining camps. Tonight, we're shifting to a different kind of ghost, places that were supposed to be fun. Vacation towns, resorts, amusement parks. All those places built for relaxation, leisure, and laughter, the very first things people abandon when money runs out or times get rough. Let's wander in, quietly, past the faded neon signs and crumbling hotels. We'll start in the Catskills of New York, once nicknamed the Borscht Belt. For most of the 20th century, this region was packed with sprawling resorts. Jewish families from New York City would escape the summer heat by coming up to the Catskills for weeks or even the whole season. Resorts like Grossinger's, the Concord, and the Nevele were household names. Pools, tennis courts, golf courses, endless buffet lines, and yes, the inevitable summer dance shows where comedians like Jerry Seinfeld or Joan Rivers got their start. For decades, the Catskills thrived. But by the 1970s and 80s, air travel got cheaper. People started flying to Florida or the Caribbean instead of driving upstate. The resorts went bankrupt one by one. Grossinger's, once so iconic that it inspired Dirty Dancing, closed in 1986. Today, it's a decaying ruin, moss-covered tennis courts, pools filled with leaves, and graffiti scrawled across grand lobbies where once there were chandeliers. The Borscht Belt is basically a graveyard of good intentions, where all-inclusive vacation turned into all-inclusive rot. Of course, the Catskills weren't the only resort zone to collapse. Let's head south to North Carolina, where the town of Princeville tells a slightly different story. Founded after the Civil War as one of the first towns built and governed by freed African Americans, Princeville became a thriving cultural center. But because of its location on a floodplain, it was constantly vulnerable. In 1999, Hurricane Floyd hit, and Princeville was devastated. Residents left, businesses shuttered, and recovery never fully came. Today, parts of Princeville feel like a half-abandoned town, still clinging on, but shadowed by emptiness. It's less resort and more community lost to nature, but it shows the same fragility. Once people stop coming, the economy collapses. Let's go back to actual resort ghost towns, like Mineral Wells, Texas. Mineral Wells started in the late 1800s, when people became obsessed with the supposed healing powers of the local spring water. Visitors flocked to drink it, bathe in it, and generally hope it would cure everything from headaches to tuberculosis. By the 1920s, Mineral Wells was booming. The most famous landmark was the Baker Hotel, a massive, Spanish-style resort with a grand lobby, ballrooms, and 450 guest rooms. But by the 1960s, people stopped believing in miracle water. Mineral wells dried up, both figuratively and literally. The Baker Hotel closed in 1972. For decades, it stood abandoned, a hulking shell, haunted in both the literal ghost hunting sense and the metaphorical, what were we thinking, sense. Interestingly, the Baker Hotel is now being restored, so its ghost town days might be over. But for a long time, Mineral Wells was one of Texas's great examples of trend towns, here for a fad, gone when the fad passed. Speaking of fads, let's float west to California's Salton Sea. The Salton Sea wasn't supposed to exist. In 1905, engineers accidentally diverted the Colorado River into a desert basin, flooding it and creating a giant inland lake. Developers looked at the new sea and thought, perfect, let's build a resort paradise. By the 1950s, towns like Bombay Beach and Salton City were thriving. Celebrities water skied, yacht clubs hosted parties, and flashy advertisements called it the Riviera of the West. Real estate boomed. People bought vacation homes on what was essentially an engineering mistake. Then the lake started to die. Because the Salton Sea had no natural outlet, salts and agricultural runoff built up in the water. Fish began dying by the millions. Beaches became piles of rotting fish bones. The smell was, let's say, memorable. By the 1970s, the tourists were gone. Today, Bombay Beach is a surreal half-ghost town. Rusting trailers, collapsing piers, street art covering abandoned buildings. People still live there, a few hundred hardy souls, but it feels more like a post-apocalyptic art installation than a resort. The Riviera of the West became the Dust Bowl of the desert. Now let's wander up the coast to Oregon. Ever heard of Bayocene? No. That's because it doesn't exist anymore. Bay-o-Seine was a planned resort community built on a spit of land in Tillamook Bay in 1906. Developers promised the Atlantic City of the West. They built a natatorium, basically an indoor swimming pavilion, along with a hotel, dance hall, and other attractions. For a while, it worked. Tourists came, bought lots, and the dream seemed alive. But nature had other ideas. The jetty system around Tillamook Bay caused massive erosion. By the 1930s, parts of Bay-o-Seine were literally falling into the sea. Houses slid down sand dunes, streets disappeared, and storms wiped out what was left. By the 1950s, the town was gone. Today, the site is just empty sand, part of a state park. Bay-o-Seine was marketed as the Queen of Oregon Resorts. Now it's just beach grass. Shall we take a short detour into the world of amusement parks? Because nothing says sad and surreal quite like a Ferris wheel rusting in silence. Take Holy Land USA in Waterbury, Connecticut. Built in the 1950s as a religious theme park, it featured miniature versions of Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and Bible scenes. It was a popular attraction for a while. Families strolled through fiberglass Holy Lands and marveled at neon crosses. But by the 1980s, attendance tanked. The park closed, and everything fell into decay. For decades, the site was a creepy ruin, crumbling plaster nativity scenes, overgrown paths, and graffiti where scripture verses once stood. A giant cross still looms over the city, but the park itself is gone. Or consider Dogpatch USA in Arkansas. Yes, it was a theme park based on the Lil Abner comic strip. It opened in 1968, because apparently someone thought hillbilly humor could sustain a Disney-sized enterprise. Spoiler, it could not. By the 1990s, Dogpatch USA was bankrupt and abandoned. Today, it's an overgrown mess of broken rides, collapsing restaurants, and raccoons living their best hillbilly lives. Vacation ghost towns don't always come from failure. Sometimes, they're seasonal, places that thrived in summer but never figured out how to survive winter. Cape May, New Jersey, for example, was once lined with sprawling Victorian hotels. In the 19th century, it was the place for wealthy Philadelphians to escape the heat. But many of those hotels eventually burned down, fell apart, or were simply abandoned when people started preferring more modern resorts. Cape May itself still exists as a tourist town, but its ghost past lingers in the empty foundations and half-collapsed houses that never got restored. Or take Asbury Park, also in New Jersey. Famous for its boardwalk and music scene, it fell into hard times in the late 20th century. Many of its hotels and attractions were shuttered, leaving whole blocks feeling ghostly. In recent years, it's had a comeback, but the ruins of its past still stand as a reminder that vacation towns can vanish faster than they arrive. And then there's Centralia, Pennsylvania, which we touched on before, but it deserves a nod here. Centralia wasn't a resort, but it became a bizarre, dark tourism site after its underground coal fire forced everyone out. For a while, people would literally go there to see smoking cracks in the road, like it was some kind of dystopian amusement park. Today, only a handful of residents remain, and the rest is sealed off. It's not a vacation town in the traditional sense, but people did treat it like one, an abandoned attraction where you could picnic next to toxic fumes. Humans are nothing if not creative with their leisure time. So what do we have tonight? Resorts that collapsed under the weight of airline tickets. Beach towns that fell into the ocean. Desert Rivieras that turned into smelly graveyards. Amusement parks built on shaky ideas. And vacation towns that simply couldn't hold people's attention once the novelty wore off. What ties them all together is the same theme: fun is fragile. Leisure economies depend on people's spare money and optimism, two things that vanish at the first sign of recession, war, or, fish corpses washing up on the beach. The ruins of resorts and amusement parks are especially haunting because they're supposed to be cheerful. A rotting roller coaster or a ballroom filled with moss looks even sadder than an abandoned factory. It's joy, abandoned. But that's where we'll leave it for now. We've checked in, explored the lobbies, peeked at the empty pools, and quietly checked out again. The resorts will stay empty. And you can finally drift toward sleep. The suburbs that never quite happened. Hey there, night listeners. Still awake? If you are, congratulations, you've now spent hours listening to the slowest, most meandering travelogue of places you'll probably never visit. And if you're already asleep, congratulations as well, you've probably dreamed about abandoned swimming pools by now. Tonight, we're wandering into a slightly different kind of forgotten America. Not mining camps, not drowned villages, not even amusement parks. We're drifting into the suburbs. Specifically, the ones that were never really suburbs at all. Because in the mid-20th century, and honestly again in the early 2000s, developers across America got very excited about building giant new neighborhoods. Shiny subdivisions, cul-de-sacs, golf courses, endless rows of houses with beige siding. The dream was that middle-class families would flock in droves, mowing their lawns and filling up their garages. The reality, in many cases, was empty streets, one or two lonely houses, and entire developments left to weeds. Let's step onto one of those cracked sidewalks now. We'll start in Florida. Because, of course we will. Florida has some of the strangest suburban ghost stories in America. Take Lehigh Acres, on the Gulf Coast. In the 1950s, a man named Lee Ratner, a Chicago pest control magnate, because that's exactly the sort of person who thinks he can build paradise, decided to turn 18,000 acres of swampland into a suburban wonderland. He carved out over 175 square miles of streets and lots. That's bigger than Miami. The problem? People didn't actually want to live in a mosquito-infested swamp far from jobs or schools. By the 1970s, only a fraction of the lots were occupied. The rest sat empty, with paved streets leading to nowhere and driveways with no houses. Lehigh Acres still exists today, technically. About 120,000 people live there. But the town is spread across such a vast, overbuilt grid that most of it feels abandoned. Drive around, and you'll see roads that dead-end into palmetto scrub, fire hydrants standing lonely in empty fields, and the occasional half-collapsed sign advertising, your dream lot. It's suburbia without the suburbs. Let's move over to Arizona, another hotbed of half-baked suburbia. In the 1960s, developers started carving up the desert around Phoenix into endless, planned communities. One of the most ambitious was Tonopah Desert Estates. Ads promised affordable lots just an hour from Phoenix, with modern infrastructure and booming growth. What buyers got was desert scrub with a few gravel roads. The lots were real. Thousands of them sold, often to people who had never actually visited. But hardly anyone built houses. Today, Tonopah Desert Estates is basically a ghost subdivision. Dirt roads lined with empty lots, occasional mobile homes scattered among cactus, and the eerie sense that someone planned a party no one showed up to. Now let's drift west again, back to California. Because California is full of these stories. Remember California City? The one we mentioned earlier with the endless empty desert grid? It's basically the king of failed suburbs. Founded in 1958, it was supposed to rival Los Angeles. Developers laid out over 800 miles of paved streets, a road network larger than San Francisco's, and then waited. 60 years later, only about 15,000 people live there, clustered around a tiny central area. The rest is just nothing. A checkerboard of paved cul-de-sacs that end in sagebrush. From the air, it looks like an enormous circuit board dropped in the desert. California City is so empty that people use it for drone racing, off-road driving, or just creepy YouTube videos. It's suburbia without houses, sidewalks without kids, and an entire municipal dream that never left the brochure stage. But it's not all desert and swamp. Some of the most surreal ghost suburbs are in the Midwest. Take North Randall, Ohio. Once home to the Randall Park Mall, one of the largest malls in America, the surrounding subdivisions were supposed to boom in the 1970s. For a while, they did. But when the mall collapsed, killed by online shopping, crime fears, and the slow death of American retail, the neighborhoods emptied out too. Randall Park Mall was demolished in 2014, but the ghostly aftermath still lingers. Empty parking lots the size of small countries, half-abandoned cul-de-sacs nearby, and roads that lead to nowhere because their commercial anchor was literally blown to dust. It's less planned suburb and more planned obsolescence. Sometimes, these failed suburbs weren't just overambitious. They were scams. Take Rio Vista, Texas. In the 1970s, a company called Great Western Cities bought up thousands of acres and marketed them as the next Dallas suburb. They built streets, installed water lines, and sold lots by the hundreds. Buyers, many from out of state, snapped them up. The problem? There were no jobs nearby. No schools. No actual city. Just empty land with pavement. Hardly anyone built homes. By the 1980s, Rio Vista was a collection of ghost streets, its fire hydrants and cul-de-sacs slowly rusting in the Texas sun. Today, it's remembered mostly as one of the great subdivision scams of the era. And then there's the Villages in Florida. Now, to be fair, the Villages is not abandoned. It's the fastest-growing retirement community in America. But its rapid sprawl shows what can go wrong. Some sections are pristine, full of golf carts and manicured lawns. Others, further from the center, feel strangely empty, roads waiting for houses that never arrived. If the Villages ever falters, it could turn into the biggest ghost suburb in history. Imagine thousands of tiki bars, shuffleboard courts, and beige ranch homes slowly decaying in the Florida sun. Not yet, but maybe someday. Now, let's take a quiet walk into the 2008 housing crisis. Because nothing produced ghost suburbs quite like that. In the mid-2000s, developers were building subdivisions at breakneck speed, convinced the housing market would never collapse. Then it did. Overnight, whole neighborhoods were abandoned mid-construction. In places like Las Vegas and Phoenix, you can still find entire cul-de-sacs of half-built houses. Some with walls but no roofs. Some with driveways but no doors. Investors walked away, banks foreclosed, and weeds moved in. For a while, these neighborhoods were squatted in, vandalized, or used for impromptu desert raves. The recession suburbs are slowly filling in now, but many never recovered. They're monuments to overconfidence, the suburban version of a ghost gold mine. And then there's Coyote Springs, Nevada. This was supposed to be a master-planned community north of Las Vegas, designed in the early 2000s. Developers promised 160,000 residents, golf courses, schools, and shopping centers. They even built the golf course first, just to show they meant business. Then the 2008 crash hit. Construction stopped. Coyote Springs today consists of one golf course, one gas station, and endless paved streets leading to nothing. It's suburbia as performance art. A town where the only residents are jackrabbits and tumbleweeds. So what's the pattern here? Ghost suburbs happen when optimism outruns reality. When developers assume that just because you build roads, people will show up. When banks think housing prices only go up. Or when one ambitious pest control magnate decides he can turn swamp into paradise. The result is always the same: roads to nowhere. Fire hydrants standing guard over empty fields. Street signs pointing to cul-de-sacs that lead only to silence. There's something especially eerie about suburban ruins. Unlike old mining camps or drowned mill towns, suburbs are so modern. They were supposed to be familiar, safe, boring even. Seeing them empty feels like looking at an alternate timeline, one where the American dream pulled into the driveway and then kept going. But for now, let's leave the suburbs where they are. Silent, half-built, waiting for residents who will probably never come. The town's history forgot altogether. Hey there, late-night wanderers. You've made it all the way to part 8. Which, frankly, means either you're extremely interested in obscure American geography, or you just haven't managed to get to sleep yet. Either way, welcome back. We've already drifted through drowned mill towns, deserted mining camps, and subdivisions that look like someone copy-pasted cul-de-sac into a desert. But tonight, let's ease our way into the quietest category of all, the places that barely existed in the first place. The almost towns. The blink and you miss it towns. The ones that flickered on a map for maybe 5 years, then disappeared so completely that even the locals don't remember them. These aren't the big ghost towns people hike to. These are the paper-thin settlements that history barely bothered to record. Let's take a lantern and wander into their shadows. We'll begin in Kansas, a state that seems to have had a town every 2 miles back in the 1800s. Most of them never made it past a few wooden storefronts. Take Broughton, Kansas. Founded in 1869 as a railroad town, it peaked at about 200 residents. Which sounds small, but back then, that was basically a metropolis in the prairie. They had stores, a school, a grain elevator, the whole package. Then the railroad rerouted. And in Kansas, when the trains stop coming, your town might as well be on the moon. By the 1960s, Broughton was down to a handful of families. In 1966, the federal government bought out the remaining landowners to build a flood control project. Today, all that's left is grassland. No markers, no plaques. Broughton is a town that lived, died, and erased itself almost perfectly. Let's shuffle north into Nebraska. Because Nebraska is basically a graveyard of half-remembered towns. One example, Monowai. Technically, Monowai still exists. It's famous for having exactly one resident, Elsie Eiler, who is the mayor, bartender, and librarian all rolled into one. But the surrounding ghost towns? They're endless. Small farming communities like DeWitte, Germantown, or Rushville popped up around post offices in the late 1800s. Most never reached more than a few dozen families. When the post office closed, the town closed. By the 1930s, the Dust Bowl wiped out many of the rest. Drive through Nebraska today and you'll pass the skeletons, an old church with no roof, a schoolhouse tilting sideways in the prairie wind, maybe a cemetery with headstones for families whose farms no longer exist. These were towns so small that once the wind knocked down the last store sign, nobody remembered what they were called. Now let's wander down into Mississippi, where forgotten towns often disappeared into the swamp. Take Rodney, Mississippi. Once upon a time, Rodney was supposed to be the capital of Mississippi. In the 1800s, it was a booming port on the Mississippi River, with banks, stores, and a population that rivaled Natchez. Then the river moved. Literally. A shift in the channel left Rodney 2 miles inland. Without river trade, the town withered. By the 20th century, Rodney was down to a handful of families and a couple of crumbling churches. Today, it's basically a ghost hamlet, eaten alive by vines and kudzu. Rodney's story is one of those ironic twists, a town so important it nearly became a capital, now reduced to a few brick ruins that most maps don't bother showing. Speaking of maps, let's glide west toward Colorado, where mining speculation created hundreds of instant towns. Take St. Elmo. Founded in 1880, it was a silver mining boomtown that briefly had 2,000 residents. They had hotels, saloons, and even a telegraph office. Then the silver crashed. By 1920, almost everyone had left. Technically, St. Elmo is still standing. Wooden buildings line its main street, preserved as a sort of accidental museum. But others, like Carson, Teller City, or Bonanza, didn't even get that much. They sprang up overnight, lasted a few years, and then collapsed when the ore ran out. Today, the forest has swallowed them so completely that hikers sometimes stumble across old stoves or wagon wheels in the undergrowth without even realizing they're standing in what used to be Main Street. Now, we'll float north to Michigan. A state full of lumber towns that blinked out the moment the last tree fell. Take Singapore, Michigan. Yes, Singapore. In the 1830s, a group of investors thought it would be a brilliant idea to build a port town on the shores of Lake Michigan. For a while, it worked. The town had mills, docks, and ambitions of becoming the Chicago of the North. But the lumber boom stripped the forests bare, and without trees, the town economy collapsed. Then the sand dunes moved in. Literally. By the late 1800s, Singapore was buried under drifting sand. Today, it's completely gone. You can walk along the beach near Saugatuck and know that beneath your feet, somewhere under the dunes, an entire town is suffocating. Singapore is a classic example of hubris: humans build, nature erases. And if you think Lost City buried under sand sounds exotic, well, Michigan has one too. Let's drift westward again, into Oklahoma, which is basically ground zero for vanished towns. When Oklahoma was open to white settlement in the land runs of the 1880s and 1890s, towns sprouted overnight. People literally staked claims on Main Street. Some of those towns survived: Guthrie, Norman, Oklahoma City. Most didn't. Take Kendrick, Oklahoma. Once a bustling farm town with stores, a bank, and schools. By the mid-20th century, the railroads shifted, and Kendrick slowly emptied out. Today, the post office is gone, the businesses are gone, and Kendrick is little more than a scattering of houses where a town once stood. Multiply Kendrick by 100, and you get a sense of Oklahoma's landscape: settlements that briefly thought they'd be the next Tulsa, and then, weren't. Now, for a final drift, let's slip back east to Maine. Because Maine has its own peculiar breed of lost town, the unincorporated plantations that quietly died out. Take Flagstaff, Maine. It was once a small but real village, with farms and families living along the Dead River. In the 1940s, the state decided to build a hydroelectric dam. The river flooded. Flagstaff vanished under the new reservoir. On calm days, when the water level is low, you can sometimes see remnants of Flagstaff's foundations beneath the surface. A whole town drowned not by accident, but by design. It's a fitting metaphor for all these forgotten places. Whether erased by rivers, sand, economics, or just sheer bad luck, they're reminders that not every town makes it. America's map is littered with ghosts, some preserved in tourist brochures, others reduced to a name on a cemetery gate. So, as we close this wandering tour of forgotten American towns, let's leave with one last image. Picture yourself standing on an overgrown road. The asphalt is cracked, weeds poking through. To one side, a rusting fire hydrant, never once connected to a house. To the other, a stone foundation, all that's left of someone's general store. The crickets are loud. The air smells like grass and dust. And if you didn't know better, you'd think no one had ever been here. But for a little while, once upon a time, this was somebody's home. And now, it's yours, at least, for the length of a sleepy bedtime story. The many ways a town can cease to exist. Welcome back, insomniacs and history drifters. You're deep into this journey now, and if you're still awake, you might be asking yourself a fair question: why did all these towns disappear? We've talked about swamps, mines, floods, sand dunes, and housing bubbles. But the truth is, there are about a dozen different ways a town can quietly vanish. And, since you're here for the long, slow ride, let's stroll through them. Think of this as a catalog of disappearance. A sleepy guide to the many creative ways Americans have misplaced their communities. Let's start with the obvious one: the railroad giveth, and the railroad taketh away. In the 1800s, if the railroad built a line through your land, congratulations, you had a town. If the railroad skipped you, well, enjoy your life as an empty cornfield. Whole towns in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas lived or died by railroad whims. A place might spring up overnight when the tracks came through. Hotels, grain elevators, general stores, all because people needed to stop for coal and water. Then, 1 year later, the company might move the main line 5 miles west. Your boomtown was instantly doomed. Imagine investing everything into your shiny new general store, only to watch customers literally roll away on rails. It happened thousands of times. That's why maps from the late 19th century are full of tiny towns you've never heard of. They existed only as long as it took a railroad company to shrug. Now, another classic: mineral exhaustion. Mining towns were always temporary creatures. Gold rush settlements, silver camps, coal towns, they thrived as long as the mine did. Once the ore ran out, or prices collapsed, the town emptied almost instantly. Take Bodie, California. At its peak in the 1880s, it had 10,000 people, with saloons, theaters, and even Chinese restaurants. Today, it's a state park frozen in time, with dust-covered furniture still sitting in abandoned houses. But most mining towns didn't get preserved. They were smaller, scrappier, and collapsed the moment investors left. In Montana alone, there are hundreds of these. You can hike a forest trail, stumble over a rusting boiler, and realize you've just walked through the heart of a vanished community. Mining created some of America's fastest growth, and some of its fastest abandonment. A third way towns vanish: flood control projects. The federal government in the 20th century was very fond of dams. Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee, TVA projects, they brought electricity, irrigation, and jobs. They also drowned dozens of towns. We already mentioned Flagstaff, Maine. But it wasn't alone. Entire valleys were evacuated in states like Tennessee, Missouri, and Kentucky. Families were bought out, cemeteries were dug up and relocated, and towns were left to sink beneath reservoirs. One of the most famous is Lewiston, Tennessee. In the 1930s, the Norris Dam project submerged it under what is now Norris Lake. Former residents held reunions on the lake shore for decades, remembering a place that no longer physically existed. So if you've ever swum in a calm, man-made lake, chances are good you were floating above someone's old post office. A weirdly haunting thought, though not one that should keep you awake, hopefully. Next, disease and disaster. Sometimes, it wasn't economics or dams. Sometimes, a town was simply unlucky. Take Centralia, Pennsylvania. A perfectly normal coal town until 1962, when an underground mine fire started. The fire is still burning today, releasing smoke and carbon monoxide. Over the decades, the government bought out residents, condemned houses, and forced evacuations. Centralia isn't technically gone, a handful of people still live there. But most of it is demolished, its streets swallowed by trees. The mine fire might burn for another 200 years. The town's biggest landmark today is graffiti-covered asphalt on an abandoned highway. Other towns died from epidemics. Smallpox, yellow fever, and cholera could wipe out entire communities in the 1800s. The survivors packed up and left, leaving behind churches, cemeteries, and stories of how a single outbreak emptied the streets. It turns out you can lose a town just as easily to germs as to economics. Another factor, agriculture shifts. Many towns in the Midwest and Great Plains existed to support family farms. They had grain elevators, hardware stores, maybe a school. But as farming became industrialized, bigger tractors, larger fields, fewer farmers, those towns lost their purpose. A town that once supported 100 family farms might now serve only 5 massive agribusiness operations. That means fewer kids in schools, fewer customers for stores, and eventually, shuttered main streets. Drive through North Dakota or Iowa today and you'll see it, tiny towns with 3 residents, or empty high schools turned into storage barns. These places weren't abandoned overnight. They just slowly faded, one tractor at a time. Now for a stranger one, marketing scams. We already touched on these in ghost suburbs, but they deserve their own sleepy spotlight. In the mid-20th century, shady developers sold dream lots in Florida, Arizona, and Texas. People bought property sight unseen, thinking they'd get in early on the next booming city. Instead, they got mosquito swamps or desert scrub. Some of these schemes left behind real infrastructure, streets, hydrants, maybe a model home. Others barely bothered with that. The result, entire towns that never actually had a population. Phantom places that existed mostly on paper and in real estate ads. The funny part? Decades later, some of these ghost subdivisions are still being resold. People keep buying lots in places no one has ever really lived. Proof that hope, like weeds, is very hard to kill. Here's another, military decisions. Sometimes, the army or federal government simply decided your town was in the wrong place. During World War II, entire communities were bought out to make way for training bases, bombing ranges, or weapons plants. In Indiana, towns near what became the Jefferson Proving Ground were evacuated in 1941. Residents had weeks to move before their homes were literally targeted for shelling practice. Other places, like Hanford, Washington, were cleared to make way for the Manhattan Project. Families were told to leave, their towns bulldozed, their land turned into secret nuclear facilities. Today, Hanford is infamous for radioactive waste, not for the peach orchards that once grew there. So yes, sometimes your town disappeared not because of bad luck, but because the military said so. And finally, the most mundane but common reason, people just left. Not in a dramatic rush, not because of fire or flood. Just because jobs were better elsewhere. Think of all the small factory towns in New England that slowly emptied after the mills shut down. Or the logging camps in the Pacific Northwest that dissolved when the last tree was cut. Or the rural post office towns that shrank one family at a time until only the cemetery remained. These towns aren't haunted by tragedy. They're haunted by boredom. Nobody wanted to stay. And so, the towns simply faded away. So, what does all this tell us? America is a restless country. Towns appear, towns disappear, and the map is constantly being rewritten. Some vanish with drama, buried under lakes, swallowed by sand, or evacuated for nuclear experiments. Others just sort of drift into obscurity, like a long exhale. What's left behind are fragments, a chimney here, a road there, a cemetery no one visits. A reminder that permanence is kind of an illusion. Even the most hopeful little town might only last a generation or two before it's erased by time, nature, or bureaucracy. But for a few brief years, each of these forgotten places was as real as anywhere else. Someone woke up there, cooked breakfast, complained about the weather, and planned a future they thought would stretch on forever. And then, quietly, it ended. Epilogue, drifting through the map of ghosts. Hey, night wanderers. We've reached the end. 10 long parts, hundreds of stories, and countless vanished towns later. If you're still with me, wide-eyed in the dark, or maybe drifting off halfway through a description of abandoned cul-de-sacs, then congratulations. You've traveled across America without leaving your bed. We've walked through mining camps, drowned mill villages, half-finished suburbs, and paper towns that never quite deserved the title. We've watched floods rise, sand dunes creep, and railroad tracks veer away like fickle gods. And now, here at the close, let's just float for a while. Not to list more towns. Not to analyze. Just to think about what it means when a place disappears. The funny thing about forgotten towns is that they're not really gone. Not completely. Sure, the buildings might have collapsed. The roads might be weeds. The names might have slipped out of memory. But every now and then, you stumble across a trace. A weathered sign on a back road. A cemetery gate rusting in the grass. A name still printed on an old map, even if no one remembers how to pronounce it anymore. These little echoes remind us that towns, even the tiniest, most short-lived ones, were real to the people who lived there. They weren't just dots on a surveyor's chart. They were homes, and stores, and front porches where someone drank their coffee in the morning, watching the sun rise over a main street that no longer exists. It's also a reminder of how restless this country has always been. America was never built to stand still. From the moment settlers crossed the Appalachians, towns were springing up and disappearing almost as fast. Some thrived. Most didn't. And even now, even in the age of suburbs and interstates, the pattern continues. Whole subdivisions rise in the desert, then empty out after a recession. Entire shopping malls, once bustling, now stand hollowed out like modern ruins. The cycle is the same. Only the style changes. We like to think of our towns as permanent. But in truth, they're more like stories. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. So what does it feel like, standing in a forgotten town? Quiet. Always quiet. You hear the wind, the birds, maybe the creak of an old signpost. You don't hear the laughter of kids, or the clang of hammers, or the whistle of trains. You imagine those sounds instead, like ghosts echoing in the air. Some people find that spooky. I find it oddly comforting. Because it means you're not alone. You're standing in the memory of other people's lives. Even if the town is gone, their presence lingers, stitched into the soil. And maybe that's why so many of us are drawn to these places. It's not about the ruins, or the photos, or even the history lessons. It's about connection. Seeing the fragile, temporary nature of our own towns reflected back at us. The same way an old mining shack tells you that prosperity doesn't last. Or a drowned church foundation reminds you that even the ground beneath our feet can change. These towns whisper a simple truth: nothing is forever. And somehow, that makes the present feel more vivid. Now, before I lull you into a full-blown existential crisis, let's soften the edges. Because yes, towns vanish. But people move on. Families relocate. New communities rise. The children of vanished towns found other homes, other jobs, other schools. Life doesn't end when a place does. It just shifts. In that sense, every ghost town is a story of continuity. The buildings may crumble, but the people didn't vanish with them. They carried their memories elsewhere, like seeds scattered on the wind. And somewhere, someone still remembers. So maybe tonight, as you're falling asleep, picture yourself on one last walk. The road is cracked, but you follow it anyway. On either side, grass sways where houses used to be. You see a stone foundation, moss-covered and half-buried. You see a rusting fire hydrant in a field. You see the outline of a street sign, its name faded by time. The air is warm. The crickets are singing. And for just a moment, if you close your eyes, you can imagine the town alive again. Children running. Doors swinging open. A horse clopping down the road. It's still there, in some quiet way. Not gone, just resting. And with that, we'll end our journey. Thank you for wandering with me through the forgotten towns of America. From the drowned villages of New England to the empty grids of California, from one-person communities to entire suburbs that never stood a chance. We've covered a lot of ground, maybe too much ground, if you ask your tired brain. But hopefully, by now, you're either fast asleep, or at least gently reminded that history is less about big battles and kings, and more about the little places where ordinary people once lived. So, dim the lights, close your eyes, and let the map of ghost towns fade into the dark. After the map fades. Hey there, night drifters. You thought we were finished, didn't you? Part 10 sounded pretty final. A bow tied neatly, a whispered goodnight. But history, and insomnia, don't really work like that. There's always one more thing to say. One more quiet thought before the lights finally go out. So tonight, let's wander past the edge of the map. Beyond the towns with names. Beyond the places with ruins, or cemeteries, or half-buried street signs. Let's think about what it really means when a town disappears, and how, strangely enough, most of us live in places that could someday follow the same path. First, a gentle reminder, permanence is overrated. We tend to treat our own hometowns as eternal. The church we grew up near, the school, the strip mall with the neon sign. They feel like they'll always be there. But if the past teaches anything, it's that towns are fragile. Even the strongest-looking ones. Take Detroit. Once the beating heart of American industry, a city of nearly 2 million people. Now, it's less than half that. Entire neighborhoods stand empty, street after street of houses collapsing into the weeds. Detroit isn't gone, far from it, but parts of it have the same quiet as a ghost town. Or think of all the small towns where Walmart showed up, drained the local stores, then left. One big box decision away from silence. If a place as mighty as Detroit can hollow out in a century, what does that say about smaller towns? Or about our own neighborhoods? But here's the thing, disappearance isn't always tragic. Sometimes, it's just natural. Humans shift. Economies change. Climate nudges us to new ground. We like to imagine we're building forever, but in truth, we're more like campers. We set up a tent, live in it for a while, then pack up and move on. That doesn't make the camp meaningless. It just means it was temporary. And maybe that's why ghost towns are oddly comforting. They show us that it's okay for things to end. A store closes, a post office shutters, the last kid leaves school. Life doesn't collapse. It just drifts elsewhere. Still, there's something magical about the traces. An abandoned church. A half-buried wagon wheel. A rusted fire hydrant in a field. These objects are like punctuation marks left behind when the sentences are gone. Archaeologists get excited about clay shards and stone tools. Future archaeologists might get just as excited about a Dairy Queen sign in the middle of an empty field. Proof that, once upon a time, humans gathered here for ice cream. And when you stand in those places, whether it's a mining camp in Colorado or a drowned village under a lake, you feel connected. Not to the ruin itself, but to the ordinary lives that pulsed through it. The weddings, the gossip, the little arguments over who owed who $1. Those moments are invisible now. But you can almost sense them in the air. Let's also admit something, part of why we're drawn to ghost towns is vanity. We like to imagine people in the future stumbling across our ruins. Our abandoned malls. Our collapsed freeways. Our cul-de-sacs turned into forests. And honestly, they will. 1,000 years from now, maybe some archaeologist will be brushing dust off the remnants of a Taco Bell, wondering what rituals happened inside. Or they'll find the skeleton of a subdivision in the desert, paved roads leading nowhere, and wonder why we were so obsessed with garages and mailboxes. Ghost towns remind us that someday, we'll be ghosts too. Not just as people, but as places. But before you spiral too far into that existential thought, let's turn it softer. Because the other thing ghost towns remind us is that presence lingers. Even after the buildings collapse, there's something left. Memory. Stories. Names whispered by families who moved away generations ago. Every time we talk about a vanished place, even in a sleepy monologue like this, we're keeping it alive. Not physically, not literally, but in that small, human way that matters. So yes, the towns are gone. But no, they're not forgotten. And maybe that's the real reason we've taken this long, slow tour. Not just to list off vanished places, but to practice remembering. Remembering that America is full of hidden histories. That not every story is about presidents or wars. That most of history, in fact, happened in small towns that no longer exist. When you think of it that way, ghost towns aren't the exception. They're the rule. The places we live now are just ghost towns waiting to happen. And somehow, that's beautiful. So here's a final image, one last bedtime picture. You're standing on a hill, looking down at a valley. 100 years ago, the valley was full of life. A mill turning on the river. Houses with smoke curling from chimneys. Children running across a dirt street. Today, the valley is quiet. The mill is gone. The houses have collapsed. Trees have crept back in, covering everything in green. But as you stand there, in the hush of twilight, you can almost hear the echoes. The laughter, the work, the hum of life. It's faint, but it's there. And you realize, the town isn't gone. It's just sleeping. Waiting for someone like you to notice. So now, really, that's the end. We've gone far past bedtime. 10 parts and then some. The story of forgotten America, told slowly, softly, with more words than anyone probably needed. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it through. If you've drifted off, even better. That's what this was always meant for. So let's close the map, fold it up, and put it away. The towns will still be there tomorrow, or not. That's the way of things. The modern ghostscapes. Hey again, night owls. So, apparently, we're not done yet. We've drifted through drowned villages, mining camps, and paper towns that never existed. But here in part 12, let's take a slow walk into something a little different, the ghost towns of the modern age. Because ghost towns aren't just dusty places with saloon doors and tumbleweeds. They can be much newer. Shinier. Sometimes, they're built out of concrete and glass. They've got escalators, or roller coasters, or runway lights. And somehow, they're just as empty. Let's start with the mall. Ah yes, the mall. Once the crown jewel of suburban life. A climate-controlled paradise of food courts, fountains, and stores that all smelled faintly of perfume samples. If you grew up in the 1980s or 1990s, the mall wasn't just a shopping center. It was the place. Teenagers flocked to it like moths. Adults treated it as both therapy and exercise. Entire movies were set inside them. And now? Well, many of them are gone. It happened slowly. First, the anchor stores started dying, Sears, J.C. Penney, the great department store dinosaurs. Then the smaller shops followed. Eventually, the fountains shut off. The escalators froze. And suddenly, your beloved suburban temple was just a cavernous shell, echoing with the sound of pigeons. Today, there are entire websites and YouTube channels dedicated to filming abandoned malls. Creepy, yes. But also strangely soothing. You walk past shuttered storefronts, with their outdated logos still hanging. You peek into the food court, where the orange tile still screams, 1989, but the tables are coated in dust. It's not so different from walking through a frontier ghost town. Just swap the saloon for a Spencer's Gifts. Next, let's float over to airports. Yes, airports. Not the busy ones where you sprint through security, but the ones that didn't quite make it. There are dozens of ghost airports scattered across the United States. Some were military airfields, abandoned after World War II. Others were ambitious regional projects that flopped when airlines stopped flying there. Take Denver's old Stapleton Airport. For decades, it was Denver's main hub. Then, in 1995, they built the massive Denver International Airport out on the plains. Stapleton closed overnight. The runways cracked. The terminals gathered dust. For years, it sat in silence, a ghost of modern travel. Or Mid-America Airport in Illinois. Built with great fanfare in the 1990s, it was supposed to be the next big hub. Only, airlines never showed up. The airport stood gleaming, new and empty. A multi-million-dollar ghost. Today it limps along with a handful of budget flights, but its reputation as the loneliest airport in America still clings. There's something wonderfully ironic about airports becoming ghost towns. Places designed to connect the world, reduced to nothing but echoing halls and weeds growing through the tarmac. And then there are theme parks. Ah, yes. The saddest ghost towns of all. Because theme parks were built on joy. They were meant to be eternal childhood. Cartoon mascots, roller coasters, the smell of fried food. And yet, many of them now stand silent, slowly decaying under the sun. Take Dogpatch USA in Arkansas. Opened in 1968, it was based on the comic strip Lil Abner. Yes, an entire theme park devoted to a hillbilly comic strip. Shockingly, that didn't age well. Attendance fell. By the 1990s, the park was abandoned. Today, the roller coasters are rusted skeletons, and the mascot statues look like haunted puppets. Or Jazzland in New Orleans. Built in 2000, rebranded as Six Flags, and then, Hurricane Katrina. The floodwaters swallowed it, and the park never reopened. Today it stands frozen in time. Roller coasters rusting. Ferris wheel unmoving. A surreal mix of carnival and catastrophe. There's something unsettling about abandoned theme parks. You can almost hear the echoes of children laughing. You can almost see the mascots waving. But it's all memory now, with vines crawling over the gates. Some modern ghost towns aren't even towns. They're suburbs that were never finished. Drive through parts of Arizona, Nevada, or Florida, and you'll find whole grids of streets paved in the desert. Street signs, sidewalks, maybe even curbs. But no houses. No people. Just empty lots stretching to the horizon. These phantom suburbs were laid out during the housing booms of the 1960s, 1980s, and 2000s. Developers expected a flood of buyers. But when the bubble popped, the houses never came. So now, you can walk down Maple Avenue or Oak Street, with no maples, no oaks, and definitely no neighbors. It's suburbia without the suburb. A ghost development. And then, of course, there are the little oddities. Like the abandoned roadside attractions, giant fiberglass dinosaurs, old mini-golf courses, motels with neon signs buzzing to no one. Or the company towns built for factories that shut down, where the rows of identical houses now stand empty, their windows boarded up. Or the stadiums left behind after a team relocates. Nothing quite says, ghost town, like a billion-dollar sports arena reduced to hosting the occasional flea market. Modern life is full of these ruins. They're just newer, shinier, and sometimes a little tackier than their 19th century counterparts. What ties them together, old or new, is the same fragile truth: places don't last forever. Your childhood mall. Your neighborhood roller rink. The airport you once flew from. One day, they may all be empty. And that's not something to fear. It's something to marvel at. Because in the end, ghost towns, whether they're dusty mining camps or fluorescent malls, remind us that even the most ordinary places hold stories. Stories of people shopping, flying, laughing, working. Stories worth remembering, even when the walls come down. So, as we drift off tonight, picture yourself wandering through one of these modern ghostscapes. You're walking past a shuttered food court. A fountain is dry, its coins long gone. You see your reflection in the glass of an old record store, but the shelves are empty. Or maybe you're strolling down a runway at a ghost airport. Grass pokes through the cracks in the concrete. A windsock flutters lazily. Somewhere, a bird nests where a jet once roared. Or maybe you're standing at the gates of an abandoned theme park. The paint is peeling. The roller coaster is frozen mid-curve. The mascot statue stares blankly into the distance. Silent. Still. Waiting. And that's enough for tonight. Modern ruins. Modern echoes. A softer kind of ghost town, but a ghost town all the same. So close your eyes, imagine the neon lights flickering one last time, and let yourself fade into sleep. The ghost towns yet to come. Hey again, wanderers. We've walked through the ruins of the past. We've tiptoed through the malls and theme parks of the present. But what about the towns that don't exist yet? Or more accurately, the towns that exist right now, alive, buzzing, glowing, but that may not be here 100 years from now. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this: no matter how permanent a place looks, it probably isn't. The ghost towns of the future are already out there. They just don't know it yet. Let's start with the desert cities. You've probably seen them, sprawling grids in Arizona, Nevada, and California, where the houses all look vaguely the same shade of beige. Palm trees planted along wide boulevards. Strip malls with nail salons and chain restaurants, all air-conditioned to within an inch of their lives. Right now, they're thriving. People are moving in. Retirees are buying condos. Families are filling schools. But water? Not so much. The American Southwest is already running short. Rivers are drying up, aquifers are sinking. And unless we invent magical new sources of water, it's not hard to imagine some of these desert suburbs going the way of St. Thomas, Nevada, drowned not by floods, but by drought. One day, the swimming pools might be empty bathtubs. The golf courses might be sand traps stretching for miles. And those cookie-cutter houses might stand abandoned, dust swirling through the driveways. A future ghost suburb. Then there are the coastal towns. Oh, they look safe now. Beaches, boardwalks, seafood restaurants. But rising seas don't care about saltwater taffy. Bit by bit, those oceanfront streets will sink under the tide. Some already have. Imagine Miami in the year 2150. Entire neighborhoods turned into scuba attractions. People kayaking past the high-rises. Fish darting through what used to be luxury condos. It sounds surreal. But then again, so did the idea of Atlantis. And we're busily building our own, one beachfront resort at a time. The ghost towns of tomorrow may not be dusty. They may be soggy. Of course, not every future ghost town will be climate-related. Some will just be unnecessary. Think of all the small towns that exist only because of one factory. Or one military base. Or one oil field. If that factory closes, if the base is decommissioned, if the oil dries up, what happens then? We've seen it before. Rust Belt towns hollowed out when steel left. Coal towns emptied when the mines shut. It doesn't take much to turn bustling into boarded up. So look around today. All those shiny tech campuses. The sprawling Amazon warehouses. Someday, they could be husks, like the mills of New England. Rows of company housing, then rows of vacancies. History repeats. The industries change, but the endings rhyme. And then, my personal favorite category, the megaprojects. Oh, you know the ones. Brand new, cities of the future, built from scratch in deserts or jungles, with glossy brochures promising green living and smart technology. They're always announced with big speeches. Drone footage of wide boulevards and futuristic skyscrapers. Diagrams showing happy families biking under solar panels. And sometimes, they're built. But just as often, they quietly flop. Take Brasilia in Brazil, a whole capital city planned in the 1950s. It exists, yes, but it never quite became the utopia its architects promised. Or look at some of the half-built, smart cities, in Asia, where shiny glass towers stand empty because people simply never moved in. It's not hard to imagine some of today's futuristic megacities ending up as the ghost towns of tomorrow. Gleaming skyscrapers with no lights on. Perfectly paved streets without a single car. Ghost towns built not from failure of industry, but from too much ambition. And then there's the quietest possibility of all, ordinary suburbs. Yes. The neighborhoods we live in right now. The cul-de-sacs with swing sets. The strip malls with dry cleaners and pizza shops. The gas stations on every corner. They feel solid. Familiar. Eternal. But think of how fast things change. 50 years ago, people thought drive-in theaters were forever. Now they're relics. 100 years ago, people thought streetcars defined cities. Then they vanished almost overnight. Who's to say our own neighborhoods won't someday stand abandoned, grass growing through the driveways, playgrounds rusting, grocery carts drifting in empty parking lots? To the people of 2125, our lives might look like quaint ruins. Just another chapter in the endless cycle of building, living, and leaving. Now, I know what you're thinking, that's a little bleak. But remember, this isn't tragedy. It's continuity. When one place fades, another rises. When one town empties, another fills. People don't vanish with their towns. They move. They adapt. They build again. That's the real story of ghost towns. Not death, but change. So, picture it. The future ghost towns. You're walking through a subdivision in Arizona. The sun is blazing. Every house is empty. Mailboxes lean at odd angles. A tumbleweed rolls through a cul-de-sac. The only sound is the wind. Or you're standing on a pier in Florida. The boardwalk is half submerged. Barnacles cling to what used to be hot dog stands. A Ferris wheel sticks up out of the waves, its seats swinging gently in the tide. Or maybe you're walking through a glass and steel, smart city, built for 1 million but home to none. The skyscrapers gleam, but every window is dark. The streets are spotless, too spotless. Empty forever. It's eerie, yes. But also strangely calm. Like stepping into the future's version of Bodie, California. And maybe, one day, someone will make a sleepy history monologue about our ghost towns. They'll talk about the rise and fall of shopping malls, or how coastal resorts drowned, or why the desert suburbs turned into sand-blown ruins. They'll describe our ordinary lives as if they were exotic. They'll chuckle at our neon signs and strip malls the same way we chuckle at towns named after coal seams. And that's okay. Because it means we'll still be remembered. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the map of America stretching forward in time. Towns lighting up, fading out. Streets being built, streets being abandoned. A slow, endless rhythm. The ghost towns of the past behind us. The ghost towns of the future ahead. And here we are, drifting in the middle. Ghost towns of the wider world. Hey there, travelers. Tonight we're leaving America behind. No more dusty mining camps in Nevada. No more drowned mill villages in New England. Tonight, let's sail overseas, nice and slow, to see what the rest of the world has left behind. Because if you thought the US had a monopoly on abandoned towns, well, not even close. Humanity has been very consistent about one thing, starting towns with big hopes, and then walking away when life got inconvenient. It's practically a global hobby. Let's start with Europe. Because of course. Take Pripyat, in Ukraine. You've probably heard of it. The town that lived and died with Chernobyl. Built in the 1970s as a model Soviet city, full of cheerful apartment blocks, schools, and playgrounds. And then, in 1986, the reactor melted down. Everyone was evacuated in a rush. And then, silence. Today, Pripyat is frozen in time. Ferris wheels that never got used. Classrooms with notebooks still on the desks. Street signs tilted but still legible. It's eerie, yes, but also strangely peaceful. Nature has crept back in, trees growing through apartments, foxes wandering down the boulevards. A ghost town made by accident, preserved by radiation. Not exactly a bedtime getaway spot, but certainly one of the most famous examples of how fast a town can vanish. From Ukraine, let's float south to Italy. The village of Crackle sits on a hill in the region of Basilicata. Medieval stone houses stacked one on top of another, winding alleys, a church tower watching over it all. It looks like a movie set. And actually, it is. They've filmed plenty of movies there. But here's the twist, nobody lives there anymore. In the 1960s, landslides made the town unsafe. The residents were relocated. Krakow became a picturesque shell. Today, tourists wander its empty streets, marveling at how intact it looks. As if the villagers all stepped out for groceries 50 years ago and just never came back. It's the European version of a mining ghost town. Same story, built, abandoned, remembered. Only with better architecture. Now let's hop east, into Asia. China is famous for its ghost cities, entire metropolises built almost overnight, with glittering skyscrapers, wide roads, and fountains. And almost no residents. Take Ordos Kangbashi, in Inner Mongolia. Built to house hundreds of thousands, complete with theaters, museums, and apartment towers. Except, barely anyone moved in. The population hovered around a fraction of what was planned. Walking through Ordos can feel surreal. Perfectly paved streets with no cars. Skyscrapers with only a handful of lights on. It's like visiting the set of a futuristic movie after the extras went home. These aren't ruins of the past. They're ruins of the present, or maybe the future. Places abandoned almost as soon as they were built. But Asia has older ghost towns too. Take Hampi, in India. Once a thriving capital of the Vijayanagara Empire, filled with temples, palaces, and bustling markets. In the 1500s, it was one of the largest cities in the world. Then it was conquered, looted, and abandoned. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists wander through the stone ruins, marveling at the intricate carvings and toppled pillars. It's hard to imagine that, once upon a time, it was as alive as any modern capital. History has a way of humbling cities. Even the greatest can fall silent. Now, let's glide over to Africa. The Namib Desert is home to Kalmanskap, in Namibia. Once a diamond mining town, founded by Germans in the early 1900s. It had everything: hospitals, schools, even a ballroom. For a while, it glittered, literally. But when the diamonds ran out, so did the people. By the 1950s, Kalmanskap was abandoned. Today, the desert has reclaimed it. Sand dunes spill into the houses, filling rooms knee-deep. Doors open onto nothing but drifting sand. It's haunting and strangely beautiful, like a painting of human ambition slowly erased by the wind. It's proof that nature always gets the last word. And while we're in Africa, let's not forget Gadam's in Libya. Known as the Pearl of the Desert, this oasis town has roots going back thousands of years. It's a maze of whitewashed mud brick houses, connected by shaded alleyways. But most of it has been abandoned in favor of modern housing. The old town stands quiet, preserved but largely empty. A ghost town that's not really dead, just set aside, like an old family heirloom. Finally, let's drift to Japan. On Hashima Island, better known as Gunkanjima, or Battleship Island, you'll find one of the most striking ghost towns in the world. It was once a coal mining colony, crowded with apartment blocks and factories. At its peak, thousands of people lived there, packed onto a tiny island. But when the mines closed in the 1970s, everyone left. Now it sits abandoned, a concrete husk in the middle of the sea. Empty stairwells. Collapsing walls. The silence of a place that once pulsed with life. It's so cinematic that it actually was used in a James Bond movie. But in reality, it's just another reminder of how quickly boom can turn to bust. The lesson, once again, is simple. Ghost towns aren't unique to one country. They're everywhere. From Italian hilltops to African deserts. From Soviet model cities to Chinese megaprojects. The reasons differ: war, disaster, economics, or just bad luck. But the result is the same: empty streets, silent houses, a lingering sense of what once was. Human beings build. Human beings leave. And the world carries on. So tonight, as you settle down, picture yourself wandering through this global gallery. You're climbing the stone steps of Crackle, hearing your footsteps echo in empty alleys. You're walking through Kalmanskap, sand crunching under your feet as sunlight pours through a half-buried doorway. You're standing on Gunkanjima, looking at the sea pounding against the walls, imagining the noise of children who once ran across the rooftops. Different continents, different stories. But the same quiet truth. And with that, let's close the passport. The world is full of forgotten towns. Too many to name, really. And maybe that's the real comfort: we're not alone in this pattern. It's universal. Wherever humans go, we build. And wherever we build, someday, we leave. Ghost towns of memory. Hey there, friends. Tonight we're not pulling out any maps. No railroad timetables, no abandoned coal mines, no dusty census records. Instead, let's turn inward a little. Because the most interesting ghost towns aren't always made of wood or stone. Some of them live only in memory. Think about it. Every single town, whether it thrives, declines, or disappears entirely, is also a web of stories. The places we remember from childhood. The old corner store that isn't there anymore. The school that shut down. The movie theater turned into a parking lot. Those are ghost towns too, in a way. Not on a grand, cinematic level, but personal ones. Tiny, intimate ghost towns that live only in our heads. In the United States, when a physical ghost town fades away, usually there are still a few people alive who remember when it wasn't empty. Ask them, and they'll tell you about church picnics, baseball games, the taste of ice cream from the local drugstore. But those people age. They pass on. And eventually, nobody remembers. That's when a ghost town really becomes a ghost. Until then, though, the stories keep it alive. A place doesn't vanish the day the post office closes. It vanishes the day people stop telling stories about it. There's a strange comfort in that thought. Take the mining camps we wandered through earlier. Physically, they're just timber skeletons in the desert. Roofs falling in, weeds climbing through floorboards. But for the families who once lived there, they're not ruins. They're memories. Grandfathers telling children about the saloon with the brass rail. Grandmothers remembering how the first schoolhouse smelled of chalk and wood smoke. For them, the ghost town isn't empty. It's full. Full of voices, laughter, arguments, and life. This isn't unique to America, of course. In Italy, when Crackle was evacuated, families carried not just their furniture, but their memories. For decades, they kept gathering at festivals, reminiscing about the old stone stairways and the church bells. Even if the town itself sits abandoned, the ghost lingers in memory. And maybe that's what matters most. Let's think about the role of nostalgia here. Nostalgia is basically the mind's way of building little ghost towns. You know how you can walk down a street you haven't seen since childhood, and suddenly you're overwhelmed by memories. The smell of baking bread from a shop that isn't there anymore. The sound of a train whistle that doesn't run. The town may still exist physically, but the version you remember doesn't. That old version has become a ghost town in your memory. Writers and poets have always noticed this. You'll find lines in old diaries about villages that felt lonely even when people still lived there. You'll find songs about places that never quite existed the way people remember them. That's because memory itself has a ghostly quality. It keeps shadows of places long after the physical structures change. In that way, all towns are temporary. All towns will eventually become ghost towns, first in the imagination, then in reality. Let's float back to the American Midwest for a moment. Thousands of farming hamlets sprouted there in the 19th century. Most of them are gone. But if you talk to locals, you'll hear about them. They'll point to an empty field and say, there used to be a town there. And then they'll tell you about the grain elevator, the church suppers, the dances. That's the ghost of memory at work. No map will show you the town. But in conversation, it flickers back into existence. There's another kind of ghost town too. The ones we build in stories we never lived through ourselves. Think about the Wild West. How many people picture a frontier town with a dusty main street, swinging saloon doors, and a sheriff's office? Most of us never saw such a place. But movies, books, and folk tales planted them in our minds. They're cultural ghost towns. Towns that never looked quite the way we picture them, but still live on in imagination. These ghost towns might be the strongest of all, because they don't need physical ruins to survive. They exist entirely in the collective memory. And then there are personal ghost towns. Maybe you've driven through the neighborhood you grew up in. The houses are still there. But the people are gone. The school you went to has been turned into condos. The park where you played tag is overgrown. For you, that's a ghost town. Not for the people who live there now. For them, it's real, alive, present. But for you, it's only a shadow of what it was. This is why ghost towns are so strangely universal. We don't need abandoned mining camps to understand them. We all carry them in our minds. Now let's slow down a little, and imagine walking through one of these memory towns. Picture the main street of a place you once knew. Maybe a corner shop that smelled of penny candy. Maybe a movie theater with red velvet seats. Maybe a bus stop where you once waited nervously for the first day of school. All of it is still there in memory. But in reality, the shop is a bank. The theater is closed. The bus stop is gone. You're walking through a ghost town that nobody else can see. That's the haunting part of memory ghost towns, they're invisible. You could be standing in a crowded city, surrounded by noise and light, but in your mind, you're walking through silence. You're remembering something that only you can see. In that sense, memory is the quietest ghost town of all. There's also a bittersweetness here. Ghost towns of memory remind us that nothing lasts. But they also remind us that everything leaves traces. No town is ever truly gone as long as someone remembers it. And even when the last memory fades, sometimes a story, a photograph, or a place name lingers. That's why maps are sprinkled with strange labels like Bold Mill or Dead Man's Gulch. They're fragments of memory, clinging on. Sometimes, the memory ghost town gets revived. Think of historical reenactments. People dress up, rebuild old houses, run steam trains. They breathe life back into places that vanished a century ago. It's not the real town, of course. It's a memory of the memory. But it shows how stubborn humans are about not letting go. We'd rather rebuild the ghost than admit it's gone forever. And then there's the opposite, the ghost towns of the future. Think about the neighborhoods we're building right now. The new suburbs. The shiny shopping malls. The office parks. One day, these too will be empty. Someone will stand in a cracked parking lot and say, "There used to be a store here." The ghost town of tomorrow is already hiding in today. That's the quiet irony. Every living town is also a ghost town in waiting. The post office, the school, the firehouse, someday they'll close. The houses will empty. The trees will reclaim the streets. And someone, maybe hundreds of years later, will wander through the ruins and wonder what life was like there. The cycle continues, endlessly. So as we close this long, sleepy journey, let's remember, ghost towns aren't only out there in deserts, swamps, or mountains. They're in us. In our memories, in our nostalgia, in the stories we tell about places that aren't there anymore. And that makes ghost towns both sad and comforting. Sad because they remind us that nothing lasts. Comforting because they remind us that we're part of a bigger pattern. Every generation builds. Every generation leaves. And every generation remembers. Tonight, as you drift off, maybe picture one of your own memory ghost towns. The street you used to walk. The park you used to play in. The house that belonged to your grandparents. It's still there, in a way. Quiet, but alive in your memory. And that, really, is the most haunting ghost town of all. Epilogue, the silence that remains. Hey again, friends. We've been wandering together for a long time now. Through deserts and mountains. Through forests and swamps. Across oceans and into memories. And now we've reached the quiet end of the road. It feels right to pause here for a moment. To let the silence of all those ghost towns settle in around us. Because if there's one thing that ties them all together, from Nevada mining camps to Japanese coal islands, from flooded mill towns to the neighborhoods that live only in our heads, it's silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. The kind that feels full. Full of echoes, shadows, and traces. Let's sit with that for a bit. Picture an abandoned house. The roof has sagged, the windows are broken, vines crawl through the siding. But when you step inside, the silence isn't blank. It's heavy. It carries all the lives that once passed through there. The laughter at the dinner table. The arguments in the hallway. The footsteps running down the stairs. They're gone, but they linger, faintly. That's the silence of ghost towns. Not nothingness, but memory folded into space. Every ghost town has its own flavor of silence. In the desert towns of the American West, it's a dry silence. Wind hissing over sand, rattling a loose shutter. In drowned towns under lakes, it's a muffled silence. The heavy quiet of water pressing down, where fish swim past church steeples. In industrial ghost towns, it's an echoing silence. Empty factories, rusting beams, the ghostly rattle of a loose chain. And in personal memory ghost towns, it's the silence of nostalgia. The strange quiet that fills you when you realize a place you loved no longer exists as you remember it. Different textures. Different shades. But all silence. Of course, silence isn't really empty. That's the secret. Stand in an abandoned town long enough, and you'll notice how loud it actually is. Birds nest in chimneys. Trees creak in the wind. Insects hum in the tall grass. Nature fills the silence humans leave behind. Slowly, patiently, insistently. It's a reminder that ghost towns aren't really about death. They're about transition. One layer of life giving way to another. Think about Kalmanskap in Namibia, the town buried in sand. The houses are empty, but the desert has moved in. The sand is alive, shifting every day, pouring through windows like an hourglass. Or Pripyat in Ukraine, where foxes and deer wander through Soviet apartment blocks. Life didn't stop there. It just changed form. Every ghost town is a reminder that the world doesn't stop for us. We're temporary. The earth carries on. And maybe that's why ghost towns fascinate us so much. They're mirrors. When we look at them, we see not just the ruins of buildings, but the fragility of our own lives. The fact that one day, the places we love will also fade. But there's comfort in that too. Because if everything is temporary, then nothing is wasted. Even a forgotten town had its moment. People lived, laughed, worked, and dreamed there. That matters, even if it doesn't last forever. There's also something gentle about ghost towns. They don't end with explosions or fireworks. They just fade. First a few people leave. Then the store closes. Then the school. And eventually, silence. It's not dramatic. It's slow. Almost sleepy. Which is why they make such good bedtime companions. We live in a world obsessed with speed, growth, progress. Ghost towns remind us that slowing down, even fading away, is part of the natural rhythm. Let's drift back to memory one last time. You carry ghost towns with you, whether you've ever stood in a real one or not. They're tucked away in your past. A childhood street. A house that isn't yours anymore. A place you once loved that has changed beyond recognition. Those are your personal ghost towns. And they're just as real as any wooden shack in Nevada. In a way, they're even more powerful. Because you carry them with you, quietly, always. So tonight, as you lie here listening, think about that. The world is full of ghost towns, out in deserts, hidden in forests, drowned in lakes, buried under sand, echoing in memory. Some are famous. Some are forgotten. Some belong to history books. Some belong only to you. And all of them share the same truth: nothing lasts forever. But everything leaves a trace. That's the real beauty of ghost towns. They prove that life leaves marks. Even when the people are gone, something remains: a wall, a doorway, a name on a map, or just a memory whispered to a child. That means your life, too, will leave marks. Even if the town you live in now someday fades, the stories won't be lost. Someone will remember. Someone will carry the trace forward. And that's oddly reassuring, isn't it? So, here we are. 16 parts later. We've walked through centuries of towns, crossed continents, and peeked into memory itself. And we've done it slowly, gently, like drifting down a long, winding river at twilight. Now the river reaches its end. The night deepens. The ghost towns fade into the distance. And all that remains is silence. So close your eyes. Picture an empty street under a starry sky. The buildings are crumbling, but the air is soft. The wind is calm. The silence is deep, but not lonely. It's the silence of rest. The silence of endings. The silence that waits for you now. Postscript, the dream of ghost towns. Hey there, still awake? Maybe. Maybe not. That's okay. This part is meant for the space between waking and sleep. By now, we've walked through so many ghost towns that they're probably blurring together. Wooden shacks with collapsing roofs. Sand-filled kitchens. Empty schools. Drowned church steeples. It all mixes in the mind until it feels almost dreamlike. And maybe that's the point. Ghost towns don't just live in deserts or forests. They live in dreams too. Think about how dreams work. You wander down a street. The buildings are familiar, but not quite. A store you used to know is there, but it sells something strange. The people look like friends, but they act like strangers. That's a dream town. Half real, half imagined. A kind of ghost town of the subconscious. Everyone carries these places. Your mind recycles the towns you've known, the neighborhoods you've walked, and rearranges them at night. That's why dream towns always feel both recognizable and uncanny. They're memory ghost towns, reshuffled. And just like the ghost towns we've talked about, dream towns are usually empty. Think of the last time you dreamed of a city or a street. How often are there crowds? Usually, it's just a few scattered people. The silence of dreams is its own kind of ghostly atmosphere. A dream town is like wandering through Kalmanskap or Crackle, but softer, stranger, more fluid. Some people say ghost towns in dreams symbolize memory. Others say they represent the fear of being forgotten. I think maybe they're just what happens when the mind wants to wander slowly through silence. When you're awake, life is noisy, cars, phones, conversations. But when you dream, the mind can build ghost towns out of that noise. Empty streets where you can finally rest. It's funny, really. We spend all day filling the world with noise and clutter. And then, at night, our brains tuck us into silent places. Abandoned classrooms. Quiet towns. Endless roads. Almost like the mind knows what we need to fall asleep, stillness. So here's a thought experiment, as you drift. Imagine walking into your own dream town tonight. It's not one of the famous ones, not Bodhi, not Pripyat, not Gunkanjima. It's yours. A collage of every place you've ever known. The grocery store your parents used to take you to. The street you walked to school on. A house you lived in for a year and then forgot. They're all there, stitched together. The lights are dim. The air is cool. And you're the only one walking through it. Every corner you turn, you recognize something. But it's always just slightly wrong. A house has too many windows. A street ends where it shouldn't. A store sign has the wrong name. That's the dream quality. Familiar, but not exact. And the more you walk, the quieter it gets. Until eventually you realize the silence itself is the town. That's the deepest ghost town of all. The one that isn't a place, but a feeling. We chase it with ghost stories, with ruins, with long road trips to see abandoned mining camps. But we already carry it. Every time we drift into sleep, we enter ghost towns built out of memory and imagination. That's why this whole journey feels fitting for bedtime. Because ghost towns are dreamlike already. They belong more to the imagination than to reality. So maybe tonight, when you sleep, you'll wander into one. You'll walk past a row of shuttered shops. You'll step into a silent school hallway. You'll sit for a while on a broken front porch. And it won't feel scary. It'll feel calm. Because you'll know, this is where the noise finally ends. The ghost town is waiting for you, not as an ending, but as a rest stop. That's all this series really has been, isn't it? A long guided walk through one ghost town after another. Not to frighten you. Not to thrill you. Just to show you how quiet they are. Quiet enough to fall asleep in. So, as we close this final postscript, let's leave the towns behind. Let them crumble, let them sink, let them fade into memory. They've done their job. You don't need them anymore tonight. You only need the silence they left behind. And it's waiting for you now. Good night. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe our channel or like, comment, share.